As they poured all their attention into it, the frequency at which the runes appeared in the fog increased by several times. It had been several hundred years since the battlefield had been born. During these hundreds of years, all the transcendents in the world were constantly adding bricks and tiles to the mist. Almost every few breaths, the runes of the Grand Tao in the mist would increase by one layer. After several hundred years, the number of great Tao runes in the fog was clearly in the trillions. With such a scale, if one was a little more ambitious, they would definitely be able to sleep peacefully. Therefore, it was only natural that those who had transcended the world would feel relaxed. However, it was clear that even though there were trillions of great Tao runes, it was still far from enough for the battle that was taking place on the battlefield. Even with so many layers of the great Tao runes, the mist was still unable to endure the shockwaves that seeped out from the battlefield. Frequently, several layers, or even dozens of layers of the great Tao runes would be broken apart with a single eruption. Such a shockwave would appear every few breaths. In this way, if they didn't work hard to strengthen the fog at all times, it wouldn't take long for the fog to be completely broken through. Even if there were trillions of great Tao runes in the fog, it was still the same. They really seemed to be throwing caution to the wind. One of the transcendents said helplessly, "Shouldn't we have known this a long time ago? They have long since been controlled by the boundless tribulation of the world and are no longer able to act on their own." Another transcendent sighed with a hint of pity on his face. "How sad. They have cultivated for so long, but in the end, they are controlled by the tribulations." Another transcendent lamented, "The profundities of the tribulations aren't something we can imagine. Right now, we can only do our best to protect the endless world and hope that this tribulation will pass as soon as possible." Every transcendent being knew that they were a part of this endless tribulation of the heavens and earth. It was impossible for them to stay out of it. Thus, at this time, the connection between the various transcendents of the world was much closer than usual by who knows how many times. After all, who knew if the others would suddenly be controlled by the tribulations and attack them instead? Naturally, they needed to communicate with others as much as possible to eliminate any misunderstandings that might arise from communication problems. With the precedent of the previous Salvation organizations, they already knew that such misunderstandings were actually the focus of the endless tribulations. That was why it was so common for several transcendent beings to gather in one place like this to appear in the boundless world. And this tighter connection allowed the transcendents to understand each other more and more deeply. Their understanding of their respective cultivation paths, and cultivation directions also deepened. In this way, the path to higher realms that they were brewing became clearer and clearer. Cultivation was something that happened all the time. Even if these transcendents were constantly helping the fog around the battlefield with the great Tao runes, it didn't mean that they would give up on their own cultivation during this period of time. Although the great Tao runes were troublesome at first and required a lot of their energy, it was still a repetitive action. As time passed and the number of times the great Tao runes increased, it naturally became an almost instinctive action for them. Once something was treated as an instinct, it would no longer take up too much of one's energy. In this way, they would naturally have more and more energy to do other things. For example, cultivation or exploring the path to take a step further. In comparison, exploring the path to take a step further was what they desired more. During the tribulations, cultivators felt the most about the importance of strength. The more severe the tribulations, the more they felt the importance of strength. This was especially true for the transcendents. Amidst the endless heavenly tribulations, they could clearly feel how weak they were. They could feel that they needed to improve further. And for the many transcendents in the endless world, what truly limited them wasn't talent, intelligence, or opportunities. Instead, it was the path. The vast majority of transcendents were limited to the third tribulation realm, because the path to the fourth tribulation realm had yet to be explored. Under such circumstances, for the vast majority of transcendents, finding the path to take a step further was clearly more important then cultivating step by step. That was why they placed the focus of their cultivation in this area. With the focus on this aspect of cultivation, the communication between the many transcendents became much closer than before. The conflicting paths of cultivation, ideologies, and knowledge caused the path that was brewing to emerge from the darkness at a speed faster than they could have imagined. Finally, at a certain moment, a third tribulation expert found this path, allowing him to brazenly break through his limits and use this path to reach the fourth tribulation. All the transcendents felt both joy and shock. How could it be so fast? According to the previous experiences, it would take at least trillions of years to find this path. A transcendent exclaimed in disbelief. Finding a new path wasn't a process that could be measured, and luck played a huge role in it. However, in reality, no matter what, the time and scale needed to explore a new path was something that could be roughly estimated. It was like tossing a coin. Whether the coin came out heads or tails, no one could know before the result was out. But if the process was repeated countless times, then the number of heads and tails would be very clear. The number of times the two would be roughly the same. Similarly, finding a path to take a step further would be the same. No existence could know when a new path would be found and how long it would take to become a fourth tribulation expert. But no matter what, this number, no matter what, it should at least be similar to the previous search process, right? In other words, the amount of time and energy needed to find a way to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse should be about the same as the amount of time and energy needed to find a way to become a third tribulation powerhouse. Perhaps it would take a little less time, or perhaps it would take a lot more time. But no matter what, it wouldn't be much less than that. This was common sense. This was the normal law of development. According to the estimation of the supreme transcendence, there were still trillions of years between the appearance of the path to the third tribulation and the appearance of the path to the third tribulation. It could barely be said that the time interval was the same as the time interval between the appearance of the path to the second tribulation and the appearance of the path to the third tribulation. Chapter 31:56. Almost every transcendent being in the world had sensed this fact. Perhaps not many of them were able to sort out this common sense and estimate the exact time when the path to the next step would appear. However, they still had a very clear sense of when the path of advancement was normal and when such a path of advancement was abnormal. It was like tossing a coin. Before the result appeared, no one could know whether the coin would come up heads or tails. When the number of times the coin was tossed was low, even if it came up heads or tails more often than half the number, most people wouldn't find it strange. However, when the number of times the coin was repeated increased to a certain extent, everyone would know that the person who tossed the coin was cheating. Clearly, no one knew how many times the coin would come up heads or tails after tossing it so many times, and no one understood the rules. However, their instincts would let them know what kind of probability was normal and what kind of probability was abnormal. It was the same for the transcendent experts at this time. Not many of them could measure the rules of when the path to the next step would appear, but their instincts told them that a time that was too different from the rules was abnormal. But at this time, the time that allowed a third tribulation expert to advance to the fourth tribulation expert was not a normal time. It was a time that was much faster than normal. Suddenly, a transcendent expert said thoughtfully, "Perhaps this is the benefit of the tribulation." His words seemed to have lifted the fog in front of the eyes of all the transcendents. They instantly came to a realization, and all their doubts disappeared in an instant. All the doubts that remained in their hearts were instantly answered. That should be it. No wonder I've noticed that the cultivation speed of the world's cultivators is much faster than before. A new path is about to appear, a transcendent expert muttered. I also feel that my cultivation has become much smoother. It's as if the original obstacles have weakened a lot. Another transcendent expert added, "My heaven and earth is growing faster as well." One transcendent being after another spoke of the various anomalies that they had encountered. By sorting out their own situations and combining them with the situations of other transcendent beings, the appearance of the tribulations had also brought them some additional benefits. More and more people agreed with this judgment. If that's the case, perhaps we've already made it through the first phase of the tribulation, a supreme transcendence said with an indescribable expression. Tribulations could bring benefits, but this was not without preconditions. With their knowledge of cultivation and tribulations, they knew very well that the benefits of tribulations did exist. However, this benefit would not appear with the arrival of the tribulation. Instead, it would only appear after the tribulation was overcome. And now, they were in the midst of the endless heavenly tribulation, but the benefits had arrived. No matter how one looked at it, it was normal for them to have helped the endless heavenly tribulation pass through a portion of it. An indescribable joy appeared on the faces of the other supreme transcendence. They also came to a similar conclusion, and to them, this was the greatest encouragement. Why had they painstakingly opened up that battlefield? Why had they painstakingly arranged for so many salvation organizations to fight there? Wasn't it to reduce the damage they caused to the endless heavenly tribulation? Wasn't it to keep the endless heavenly tribulation away from it? Under such circumstances, there was suddenly evidence that they had achieved the first phase of their goal. They had taken the first step to keep the endless heavenly tribulation away from it. The feeling was self-evident. Suddenly, one of the supreme transcendence sighed. However, our path of transcendence might no longer exist. The hearts of the other supreme transcendence shook, and they frowned slightly. Soon, they began to test each other. After this test, they all sighed inwardly. Indeed, they could sense the path of transcendence with just a thought. But now they could not sense it at all. At this moment, they could no longer find any way to transcend and leave the endless heavenly tribulation. It was as if they had not reached the requirement to transcend and leave the endless heavenly tribulation. Suddenly, one of the supreme transcendents smiled and said, "As expected, this new path is correct." His expression was filled with excitement. Many transcendent experts also reacted at this time. What exactly was going on? This situation had happened several times before. Last time, it was when the second tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend and leave. The time before that, it was when the tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend and leave. Now, the third tribulation experts lost their chance to transcend. Compared to the previous two times, there was no difference in essence. It was because the endless heavenly tribulation's capacity had expanded, and this clearly meant that the endless heavenly tribulation had grown tremendously. Was this not a good thing? It seems that staying here was the right decision, one of the supreme transcendents said. To all the transcendents present, they had given up on the chance to transcend and stayed behind. Given their choices, even if they lost the chance to transcend and leave the boundless world, it wouldn't affect them in any fundamental way. After all, they would not choose to transcend, even if they could. In comparison, they were more concerned about the meaning behind not being able to transcend. They had stayed in the endless heavenly tribulation because they were reluctant to part with their own world and the endless heavenly tribulation. It was because there were too many things they were reluctant to part with that they had given up their chance to transcend and leave. But now that the chance to transcend had disappeared, it meant that the endless heavenly tribulation had grown. To them, this was naturally something worth celebrating. Next, the supreme transcendence did not waste any time and immediately began to organize the path they had taken. They used the connections between the heavens and earth to share it and spread it to all the supreme transcendence. This was almost selfless sharing. Naturally, it was not because they were selfless or selfless. The reason why they shared it was because they knew that it was impossible to hide this path. With so many supreme transcendents who did not have a few friends, who did not have friends of the same path, could it be that every single one of them would completely conceal this path? It was clear that most of them would do so, but there would definitely be people who would pass on this path to their friends of the same path. As long as such a transcendent expert appeared, the path forward would be known to all the other transcendent experts. After all, how could there not be such friends and friends of the same path? If you pass it on to your friends, they would pass it on to their friends, and friend would pass it on to their friends. In the end, everyone would know. In this way, by hiding this path forward, it was obvious that it was impossible for them to truly monopolize this path. At most, they would just delay the time when other supreme transcendents learned of this path. But for those who had transcended, what did time count for? A few hundred years, a few thousand years, or even tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, were all insignificant to them. Concealing this path for this little bit of time would ultimately incur the resentment and dissatisfaction of the supreme transcendents who learned of this path because they were too slow. This was clearly not worth the loss. If one day another path appeared, but they were slowed down by this dissatisfaction and others learned of this path, then it would be a great loss. In comparison, directly publicizing this path would allow everyone to obtain it at the same time and have everyone owe them a favor. Wouldn't that be much better than having those cultivators be dissatisfied with them? It was precisely because of this consideration that they chose to be impartial at this time. Of course, in reality, this had already become the basic principle for many supreme transcendents to interact with each other. The previous road expansions were also announced in such a selfless manner. Even if they didn't consider the pros and cons, just the fact that they had accepted the impartiality of others meant that they had to be impartial now. After publicizing this path, these supreme transcendents didn't waste any more time and began to diligently cultivate in their own world. Although they had publicized this path, it didn't mean that they had lost their advantage. The founders and the learners were completely different. As the pioneers of this path, it would be many times easier for them to walk this path compared to those who had learned it. If the other transcendent beings needed to overcome 100 difficulties before they could truly walk on that path, then they only needed to overcome 10 difficulties to walk on that path. Of course, this was only an assumption. In reality, from a third tribulation to a fourth tribulation, there were more than 100 difficulties. As for how many difficulties they had to overcome, it depended on the cultivation path of these supreme transcendents. After all, this path of advancement only told them how to sublimate their own cultivation path and how to progress further within the framework of their own cultivation path. There was no specific cultivation method to tell them how to use their divine abilities, how to use their power, and how to push their own essence to achieve a breakthrough. After obtaining this path, what they knew was only equivalent to a direction. As for how to do it, they had to combine it with their own way of cultivation and their own ideas. They had to create it bit by bit and perfect it bit by bit in order to be able to do it. In this way, it would be up to them to decide what kind of difficulties they would encounter in the process of cultivation. Perhaps some cultivators only needed to overcome 1 or 2 difficulties to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse. Perhaps some cultivators had a longer path of cultivation and needed to overcome thousands of difficulties before they could reach the fourth tribulation. But none of this was certain. Perhaps some cultivators had a longer cultivation path and needed to overcome thousands of difficulties to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse. This was all uncertain. As such, even if these founders had such a great advantage, whether they could become the first to become a fourth tribulation powerhouse would depend on luck. After all, as the pioneer of this path, it would be quite embarrassing if he was unable to be the first to break through in the end. After all, as the founders of this path, if they couldn't be the first to break through, it would be somewhat embarrassing. Due to the appearance of this new path, the endless world was much more peaceful than before. After all, with the appearance of a brand new path, both third tribulation experts and non-third tribulation experts would need to reorganize their cultivation paths according to this path. After all, with the appearance of a new path, whether it was a third tribulation powerhouse or a non-third tribulation powerhouse, they all needed to reorganize their cultivation paths according to this path. If it wasn't for the fact that they needed to constantly protect the fog outside the battlefield, they might have even stopped their basic communication. If it wasn't for the fact that they needed to support the fog outside the battlefield at all times, they might have even stopped communicating. Not only did the Great Tao runes appear faster, But the Great Tao runes also became more and more complicated as time passed. The reason for this was very obvious. It was because when those who had transcended reorganized their own paths of cultivation, their own cultivation realm was constantly improving and improving. Because of the increase in their cultivation realm, the defensive augmentation methods they used naturally became more and more brilliant. Just like this, after a few hundred years, the Great Tao runes in the fog finally formed a balance with the destruction caused by the various impacts leaking out of the battlefield. And at this time, the level of the Great Tao runes had also decreased to a relatively dangerous level. The establishment of this balance was extremely important to the stability of the fog, or rather, to the continuation of the defensive formation. And the moment this balance was established, the situation underwent a huge change. It could be said that when the balance was established, it meant that the threat of the battlefield to the endless world had been weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. Chapter 31:57. The development of the situation was not unexpected. As time passed, it became harder and harder for the shockwaves leaking out of the battlefield to affect the fog around the battlefield. At the beginning, when the balance was established, the shockwaves could still destroy the Grand Tao runes in the fog. But as more and more transcendents set foot on the path to the fourth tribulation, the nature of the runes of the Great Tao they were buffed with started to improve. Their buffing ability on the mist also became stronger and stronger, and the impact they could withstand naturally became stronger and stronger. Just like that, after hundreds and thousands of years, the endurance of the Tao runes finally surpassed the destructive limit of the impact that leaked out from the battlefield at a certain moment. The result was that from then on, no matter how strong the shock waves leaking out of the battlefield were, the fog would only ripple slightly, and it would no longer cause all sorts of mysterious scenes like before. Facing such a change, the transcendents outside the battlefield finally felt relieved. At this moment, they finally confirmed that the endless world outside the battlefield had passed the endless world tribulation. What they needed to do next was to wait. When the result of the battle and the battlefield came out, when the last remnant of the tribulation gradually calmed down, the endless world would have passed the tribulation. Without this worry, they had more information to use on their own cultivation, and their cultivation became even smoother. In the end, tens of millions of years after the path to becoming a fourth tribulation expert was sorted out, the first transcendent expert of the fourth tribulation level finally appeared. In just a short period of 10 million years, he had broken through to the next level. This speed could be said to be heaven-defying. However, those who had transcended did not feel that there was anything wrong with this kind of breakthrough speed. Every time a new Tao was discovered, a transcendental being would quickly appear who had taken this Tao and achieved a breakthrough. Although the 10 million years this time was much faster than the previous times, compared to the short time between the first path's appearance, this time was actually very long. When the first transcendent expert of the fourth tribulation level appeared, the entire world began to tremble indescribably. As the tremble spread, the battlefield suddenly erupted with heaven-shaking rumbles. As the rumbles echoed, countless cracks appeared on the battlefield. Unimaginable shock waves poured out from the cracks and rushed into the endless fog around the battlefield. They stirred the fog, causing the runes of the Great Tao that had been hidden for millions of years to flash madly. Then, after flashing madly, they were quickly destroyed by the shock waves. Clearly, the strength of the shock waves had surpassed the tolerance of the Grand Tao runes in the fog. As this change appeared, the various influences on the battlefield began to reveal their true nature. It seemed to be a kind of shock wave, but in essence, it was just an appearance formed by the fusion of countless strange influences. If it was really broken down, it could even be broken down into countless divine abilities, endless strange powers, and all kinds of unbelievable powers. There were even all kinds of spells, all kinds of lights, and all kinds of incomparably strange and indescribable existences that would terrifyingly corrode just by hearing their names at this moment. As the shock waves broke through the Grand Tao runes in the fog, the endless existences hidden in the shockwaves finally began to break down. They either began to produce all sorts of terrifying effects in the fog, or they tried their best to charge out of the fog and affect the endless world. Not long after, the fog seemed to turn into an endless world, and a space-time that displayed endless, unbelievable light and shadows. There were even unimaginably strange sounds. This is the last wave. At this moment, all the transcendents understood what was going on. This was clearly the last wave of the endless tribulation. After this wave of explosion, no matter how great the impact on this boundless world was, whether it would completely destroy this boundless world or be easily blocked by the power of this boundless world tribulation would completely dissipate. In other words, this meant that there wasn't much time left before the endless tribulation truly disappeared. At this moment, how could the transcendents dare to be careless? At that moment, boundless power began to frantically gather towards the battlefield from many worlds. This power surged through the void, emitting all sorts of subtle splendor, making each strand of power look like a beam of light. At this moment, endless power erupted from all over the endless world and gathered at the battlefield. In an instant, the fog around the battlefield turned into a sun. It was an incomparably huge sun that emitted endless light. It was so huge that every part of the endless world seemed to have its own reflection in the void. At this moment, all the living beings in the endless world suddenly discovered that two suns had suddenly appeared in the sky. One was the sun they were familiar with, the sun that had cycled in their world for billions of years. The other one was 10 times bigger than the one they were familiar with. They felt a piercing pain in their eyes just by looking at it. It was as if their vision had been completely destroyed. Fortunately, the sudden appearance of this sun quickly triggered the natural defense mechanism of the world. Very quickly, a power enveloped the sun and weakened its light to a level that all living beings could bear. This prevented all the living beings in the endless world from losing their vision. However, it was clear that all of this was relying on the natural defense mechanism of the world. At this moment, none of the transcendents had the time to pay attention to such a trivial matter in their own world. At this moment, all the transcendents were wholeheartedly focused on defending against the various effects that leaked out from the battlefield. At this moment, the battlefield seemed to be releasing all the power of the world and the power of all the organizations that had entered it, bringing about an unimaginable impact on the outside world. The surroundings of the battlefield looked like fog, but in essence, it was a defensive formation formed by the transcendents outside. Under this kind of release, it was like a piece of paper that was torn apart layer by layer without any ability to resist. The appearance of this was that the countless layers of great Tao runes that existed in the fog were collapsing layer by layer. Countless fragments of great Tao runes were being pushed out of the fog by the impact and turned into specks of power runes that dissipated into the endless void between the heavens and earth. At this moment, the power gathered by the transcendents poured into the fog to repair the damage suffered by the fog and replenish the Grand Tao runes. This time, these Grand Tao runes were no longer directly buffed by the Grand Tao runes in the fog. It was not like the beginning, where they were just increasing the foundation of the Grand Tao runes. Instead, he directly appeared at the very front, at the front line of the endless impact that leaked out from the battlefield. He directly repaired the collapsed runes of the Great Tao and did his best to block the terrifying impact that leaked out from the battlefield. This method could not be said to be ineffective. However, it was clear that the instant effect was not something that could be imagined. The infusion of this boundless power only slowed down the expansion of the impact that was leaking out. There was still a long way to go before it could truly be stopped. At this moment, a figure of light that was different from the other endless powers shot out from somewhere in the endless world toward the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, it arrived outside the fog around the battlefield. It was not power, but a cultivator, a transcendent that all the other transcendent cultivators were familiar with. It was none other than the transcendent cultivator who sorted out the path for a third tribulation cultivator to reach the fourth tribulation. However, he was no longer a three tribulation cultivator like he was before. But now, he was a true fourth tribulation expert. His strength was more than 10,000 times stronger than when he was a third tribulation cultivator. At this moment, the sense of existence that flowed out from his body was so strong that even across the endless world, all the transcendent cultivators couldn't help but focus most of their attention on him. Clearly, this transcendent had seized the opportunity and was the first to step into the fourth tribulation realm before all the other transcendent transcendents. He was the pioneer of the transcendent transcendents who were born and raised in this world. Although it's only the beginning and still needs a long time to stabilize and grow, dealing with the current situation shouldn't be a problem. The transcendent cultivator floated outside the fog and thought to himself. With this thought, he suddenly raised his hand and slapped the fog in front of him. In an instant, endless light burst out from his body. This light was so bright and dazzling that it even surpassed the light formed by the endless power of the world. Of course, this was only the brightness. In the end, he was only a single transcendent cultivator. Although he was a fourth tribulation cultivator, his size was still much smaller than a part of the world. There was no need to even mention comparing him to the combined power of the endless world. Although the fog in front of him was not the convergence of all the power of the world, just a small portion of the power of the world gathered together was already far greater than the power of a fourth tribulation cultivator. Therefore, his light was not as bright as the light from the fog in front of him. However, in terms of size and mass, it was still much smaller than the light from the fog. If the light from the fog was a huge sun, then the light from this fourth tribulation cultivator was only as bright as a light bulb that was comparable to the sun. In the eyes of all living beings in the endless world, this was like a second sun that suddenly had a bright spot around it. It was like a small star that suddenly appeared around the sun in the daytime, but the sunlight couldn't cover its radiance. The light emitted by this transcendent being at the fourth tribulation level was mixed with countless runes, divine abilities, power, and other indescribable and unimaginable existences. Although these existences looked heterogeneous, they were combined in an unimaginable and ingenious way. They complemented each other, promoted each other, and ascended together. The final result was that the combined power of the whole was tens of thousands of times stronger than the sum of their individual powers. At this moment, as he moved, these existences rushed towards the fog in front of him along with the light he gave off. In the blink of an eye, it had permeated the entire mist, and it was practically boundless. It had brought all the grand Tao talismans, all the energy, all the fluctuations, all the divine abilities, all the techniques, all the might, and even all the other indescribable existences within the mist into its grasp. It was to the extent that even the various incredible existences that leaked out from the battlefield could not truly escape his control at this moment. Under his influence, they began to undergo various subtle changes. However, it was clear that this fourth tribulation cultivator did not have such delusions about completely controlling the existences that leaked out of the battlefield. After all, those were existences that had been created by the power of tribulations. Even though he was already a fourth tribulation cultivator, he could not compare to those existences in essence. It was impossible for him to completely control those existences. It was already quite rare for him to be able to slightly influence those existences with this kind of control. His true focus was naturally the endless power, might, spells, divine abilities, and other indescribable existences that came from the endless world. In an instant, he felt as if his body had suddenly expanded by hundreds of millions of times. An indescribable feeling of power surged into his heart. This was none other than the feeling that he was controlling. The feeling that the indescribable existences from the endless world gave him could be said to be an illusion. After this feeling appeared, he did not hesitate at all. He directly controlled the countless existences to reconstruct them according to his will. Chapter 3158. These existences, which were gathered from millions and millions of transcendents, were naturally inconceivably terrifying in terms of quantity. However, most of them were only evolved under the control of transcendent cultivators below the third tribulation. As a result, their overall structure was only at the level of a third tribulation cultivator at most. Compared to the infinite beings that had gathered here, this level was clearly equivalent to using the technology used to make lighters to make nuclear bombs. Clearly, the true potential of these existences had not been unleashed at all. Under such circumstances, the fourth tribulation master's current action was to eliminate this weakness of these existences. He used his fourth tribulation master's cultivation realm to control these existences, to construct a structure that could better utilize these existences' potential and to stimulate these existences' greater potential. Even though a fourth tribulation expert was still extremely weak compared to these endless existences, and the structure formed from their cultivation realm was still incomparably far from being able to unleash the full potential of these existences. But in the end, it was still able to unleash the potential of these existences better than the structure formed from the combined efforts of most transcendents who were below the third tribulation expert level. Originally, the ones who should be taking action at this time were the sixth tribulation cultivators. The sixth tribulation cultivators themselves were tens of millions of times stronger than the fourth tribulation cultivators, even billions of times stronger. In that case, they could reconstruct these existences with their own cultivation level, which would naturally stimulate the potential of these existences even more closely. In fact, it was not impossible to unleash all of these existences' potential. However, even though the six tribulation cultivators had also participated in this endless world tribulation, they were still separated from this endless world. It was not only because they were outsiders and not native cultivators of this endless world, but also because they clearly knew that this tribulation was tens of thousands of times more threatening to them than to the other transcendent cultivators of this endless world. Although the native transcendent cultivators of this endless world would also be affected by the endless world's tribulation and even be controlled by it, they were a part of this endless world. It could even be said that they were an extension of this endless world. Therefore, this tribulation still had its limits. In other words, no matter how strong the tribulation was, it was only limited to an acceptable level, just like the organizations of salvation in the battlefield. Even though they'd fallen under the control of the tribulation, they'd only been affected no matter what, and not a single one of them had been completely assimilated by the tribulation to become a part of its source. This was a sign that the tribulations had a sense of propriety. In comparison, these six tribulation experts were clearly different. They were foreign cultivators. Although they had been accepted by the islands and the endless world, they were still a part of the endless world. However, no matter what, they were still cut off from the boundless world. The most obvious difference was that the path of cultivation in this endless world had only been opened up to the level of fourth tribulation cultivator, and it had only recently been opened up to this level. And the cultivation of those six tribulation experts had clearly far surpassed this level. And this was only one of the many. Apart from this extremely obvious division, there were even more divisions. Under normal circumstances, all of this was nothing at all. It would not have too obvious of an effect on the boundless world or themselves. However, it was clear that these normal circumstances didn't include the endless world that was in the midst of a tribulation. This tribulation was a test for the endless world. For the endless world to truly stabilize, for it to truly grow, and for it to truly be recognized by the state of chaos, this tribulation was unavoidable. If one were to make an analogy, the state of chaos accepting the endless world was equivalent to a school accepting a certain student. And the tribulation was equivalent to the school's test for the student. That's right. When you entered the school, you were already a student of the school. However, this didn't mean that you would be able to sit back and relax. What awaited you next would be test after test, test after test. If you passed the test, or even got full marks, that would naturally be for the best. The school would continue to recognize you as a student. There might even be rewards. However, if you failed the test, unless it was compulsory education, you might even be expelled at this time. This was the case for the endless world. When the endless world was controlled by the overall latent consciousness of the transcendent, the path of Tao Master, or the state of chaos, had already accepted it. Using the analogy just now, this school that was in a state of chaos had already accepted the identity of endless heaven and earth as its students. And at this time, the endless world tribulation was a test for the endless world. This test was obviously testing the growth speed of the endless world. It was testing whether the growth speed was fast enough and whether the growth method was healthy enough. If it didn't grow fast enough and wasn't healthy enough, the school might just expel it. If the endless world was a student, then the transcendent native to the endless world was equivalent to the real knowledge and real power of the students. Naturally, the test would never restrict the use of this real knowledge and real power. In fact, they even wished that this real knowledge and real power could be used to create a flower. In contrast, the six tribulation experts, who were obviously separated from the transcendent native to the endless world, were obviously different. This kind of existence was like a book in a closed book exam, like a calculator in a math exam, like a tutor in a tutoring institution outside. This kind of existence could naturally be used at will at other times. Even if you used some despicable means to suck it dry, it would only be encouraged, not criticized. However, this kind of thing was definitely not allowed to appear in the examination or during the test. Ordinary schools would directly expel it from the examination room after it appeared. But some schools would directly include it in the calculation of the difficulty of the test after it appeared. That was to say, the original difficulty was only a test for the students. It was only a test for the situation where there were no books, calculators, or tutors. However, if these books, calculators, and tutors appeared in the examination room, it would have to directly redesign the test for the situation where these books, calculators, and tutors were present. Obviously, such a change would not only greatly increase the difficulty of the test, but the things brought into the examination room would also be subjected to a test that had nothing to do with them. At this time, to the endless world, the six tribulation experts were like existences that should not have appeared in the examination room. Originally, this test should not have much to do with them. The level of this endless world's tribulation should not be too high. However, if they were to actively participate in it, everything would change drastically. Not only would the intensity of the endless world's tribulation soar by 1,000 times, but even they themselves would have to endure a test that was equivalent to their level, compared to when they had been watching coldly from the sidelines, where the level of the endless heavenly tribulations was only at the current level, and they themselves had only encountered a test similar to those who had transcended the three tribulations. Clearly, there was a world of difference between the two. Obviously, not many of the six tribulation experts could truly understand the essence of this. However, just because they did not understand it did not mean that they did not know what to do. Even if they did not understand what was going on, they were still six tribulation experts after all. They had cultivated from ordinary living beings until they could easily destroy the world and split the world apart. For people like them, the sense of danger had almost become an instinct. They might not be able to explain clearly what might bring them danger and what actions might bring them benefits, but they would definitely have some sort of feeling. In the face of this endless world's tribulation, their feeling was clearly telling them that if they got too involved, what awaited them would be a disaster. Even if they were only clones, incarnations, or projections of true six tribulation experts, and the damage to their bodies did not have any intrinsic impact on their true bodies. This did not mean that they did not have a desire to live, nor did it mean that they felt that their lives could be casually abandoned. Perhaps this was their value to the real bodies. However, to the real bodies, their lives were their own lives. If they were to lose them, they would truly die. Under such circumstances, how could they be careless when faced with a choice that could bring about a disaster? It was precisely because of this that even the six tribulation experts did not truly understand what was said above, and not many people could truly explain what the possible dangers were. However, This did not prevent them from carefully limiting their strength during the long process of the endless world's tribulation. They did not stay too far away from the tribulation, nor did they overly participate in it. It was precisely because of this that the existence of these 6 tribulation experts was so weak ever since the outbreak of the endless world's tribulation. They were like ordinary transcendent experts in this endless world. They did not display a strong desire to make a move, nor did they display the knowledge and methods that a 6 tribulation expert should have. Therefore, at this time, the 6 tribulation experts clearly knew that as long as they made a move, they would be able to stimulate most of the unfathomable existence that came from the endless world's boundless world. Yet, none of them truly made a move. It was only when a 4 tribulation expert among the native transcendent experts personally made a move that this great waste was barely rectified. It was not that the native transcendent experts did not have any doubts about the 6 tribulation experts not actively making a move. It was just that their level was not high enough, and they did not know how unfathomable and powerful the 6 tribulation experts were. Therefore, they did not know how much strength they had. It was only because there were too few 6 tribulation experts, and their combined strength was insignificant compared to the endless world's tribulation. Even if they used their full strength, they would not be able to change the situation in this endless world. That was why they were not forced to make a move. Just how much did they pull? Even I could do this. If they really made a move, they would definitely be able to do it even more perfectly. At this time, outside the fog, the 4th tribulation cultivator, who was using his own cultivation realm to reconstruct the endless runes of the great Tao in the fog, reconstructing the inconceivable existence gathered by many transcendents, had such a thought flash through his mind. It turned out that he was just like the other native transcendent experts. He thought that the 6 tribulation experts were just holding back a little and did not really go easy on them. However, now that he had truly stepped into the level of a 4 tribulation expert, he knew that his guess might be a far cry from the truth. Even he, as an initial 4 tribulation expert, could stimulate so much of the gathered existence's potential, increasing their power by at least 10,000 times. If a real 6 tribulation expert were to make a move, how much more powerful would they be? At this moment, an indescribable resentment emerged from the bottom of his heart. If those 6 tribulation experts had used their full strength, this endless world would not have suffered such a great loss. Perhaps the endless world's tribulation would have been dealt with long ago. In the past, before the endless tribulation of the world had dissipated outside, just his resentment alone would have been enough to pull him into the endless tribulation of the world. He would have become the power of the endless tribulation of the world, and he would have become the existence that he feared, the existence that brought endless blows to the endless world. Fortunately, the endless world's tribulation had already gathered in the center of the fog. Outside the fog, it had mostly disappeared. At this moment, in the mist, endless runes of the great path appeared, forming all sorts of indescribable and strange things. It was as if an endless world of runes of the great path was being born. The scene looked incomparably mysterious. Chapter 31:59. Along with these changes, the fog rapidly stabilized. At this time, the battlefield also gradually stabilized. To be more precise, the wreckage of the battlefield was gradually stabilizing. At the center of the mist, the battlefield had already shattered into countless fragments. Within those fragments, the supreme transcendents were looking around in bewilderment, as if they couldn't believe what had happened. It was clear that everything that had happened had exceeded their expectations. "What have we done?" One of the supreme transcendents murmured, his voice filled with regret. At this time, apart from the remnant fragments, everything in the battlefield had turned into unimaginable existences that bombarded the surrounding fog that had been reinforced by the countless runes of the Great Path. In the fog, the runes of the Great Path continued to collapse and regenerate. Endless light gathered from all directions to the places where the runes of the Great Path had collapsed, allowing the runes of the Great Path to recover, as if time had been reversed. They once again stood in front of the endless existences of the battlefield. They were like dams that were constantly recovering, protecting the fog itself and everything around it. When the transcendent beings came back to their senses, they discovered that they were also in a precarious state. At this moment, the existence formed by the boundless battlefield did not let them off either. It was also charging towards them at all times. If it wasn't for the fragments around them withstanding the impact and destruction for them, their true bodies would have collapsed and their souls would have perished, leaving only a bit of spirit light to return to their own world. It was just like the supreme transcendence who hadn't appeared in the wreckage of the battlefield. If we really end up like that, then we'll probably sink for trillions of years before we can recover. The supreme transcendence couldn't help but panic when they thought of this outcome. For these supreme transcendents, their deaths weren't true deaths. At least, this was the case if only their true bodies died. After all, these supreme transcendents and their own world, which was also the source of their transcendence, had an extremely close connection. It was naturally an exaggeration to say that this connection was 1 to 2 and 2 to 1. However, it was not an exaggeration to say that heaven and earth were the sustenance of their bodies and minds. Therefore, there were two conditions to completely kill them. The first was to erase their true bodies. The second was to completely destroy the heaven and earth that was the foundation of those who had transcended. Only by completing these two steps could one truly kill the transcendent. As long as either of these two steps were not completed, the transcendent would be able to sleep in peace. If his true body hadn't been destroyed, then needless to say, he wouldn't have been injured at all. On the other hand, if their true bodies were destroyed, then the foundation of their transcendence would not be destroyed. That situation would be much worse than if their true bodies were not destroyed. However, they would still have a chance to come back. Because of the close connection between these transcendent beings and the world, a part of their existence was entrusted to the world. This part of existence usually only gave them unimaginable authority over heaven and earth. Once their true bodies were destroyed, then this part of existence would instantly become their last chance of survival. It would bring along a bit of their life force and enter the reincarnation cycle of heaven and earth, borrowing the power of reincarnation to be reborn. However, if that was the case, then it would be difficult to find everything that their true bodies had. After reincarnation, although their realms remained the same, all the power, strength, divine abilities, might, and everything else that their true bodies possessed would have to be cultivated anew in order to recover. Even if it was a tribulation stage powerhouse, even if they had their own cultivation as a foundation, it would take at least a few trillion years of cultivation day and night for them to recover from zero. In other words, once their true bodies died, it would be equivalent to wasting a few trillion years of development. This kind of loss was a huge price for those who had transcended. And this was without taking into account the consequences of the enemy's attack. If the enemy was included, then the result would be even more tragic. This was because before their cultivation realms recovered, the supreme transcendents were extremely weak. If the enemy took advantage of this opportunity to destroy the foundation of the supreme transcendents along with their true bodies, then what awaited them would be the destruction of their souls, never to be reincarnated. It was precisely because of this great danger that the supreme transcendents decided to open up a battlefield as their battlefield and have everyone enter the battlefield to determine the victor. Only then would it be acceptable for the salvation organizations. After all, even though death in the heavenly battlefield couldn't be considered as true death, death in the heavenly battlefield meant that one was only a step away from death. But once he won, he would be able to easily push past that one step. This was what they thought when they faced the endless tribulations of the world. At this moment, they began to rejoice over their initial thoughts. It was precisely because they had such thoughts that they could still turn the situation around. Fortunately, if I didn't leave a way out, my sins would be great. The supreme transcendents more or less had similar thoughts. Because of these thoughts, they felt much more at ease. Some of them didn't even intend to use their own power to support the fragment of the battlefield they were in. They simply allowed the other existences in the battlefield to destroy the fragment of the battlefield they were in. Then, the unimaginable existences covered them and crushed them bit by bit like a stone mill grinding beans, causing their true bodies to perish completely. The ones who did this were the supreme transcendents who felt that they no longer had any hope of escaping. At the same time, they felt extremely regretful for their previous actions. Of course, the number of such supreme transcendents was still relatively small. The remaining supreme transcendents might have regretted their actions in the battlefield and felt despair at their current situation, but they didn't lose their will to resist. They still did their best to resist the attacks from the various inconceivable existences in the battlefield. The end result was that after an unknown amount of time, the ruins of the battlefield were reduced to some faintly discernible transcendence of the sixth tribulation level, floating amidst the endless attacks and endless terror. As for the rest, those who hadn't reached the sixth tribulation, they were all completely annihilated by the various existences on the battlefield. At this moment, a supreme transcendent at the sixth tribulation level said, "The tribulation should be completely over. We can't take the risk. Although it feels like it's over, the aftershocks of the final attacks still haven't disappeared. If we take action now, we might fall short of success." Another supreme transcendent at the sixth tribulation sighed. In the endless tribulations of the world, these supreme transcendents felt extreme pressure. As supreme transcendents, they had no choice but to participate in the endless tribulations of the world. They had no choice but to play their roles according to the requirements of the endless tribulations of the world. They had to fight, scheme, and kill. However, due to the reasons mentioned earlier, they couldn't use their full strength. They had to restrain their own strength, their own cultivation, their own abilities, and their own might. They couldn't use methods that were too powerful, lest they incite the endless tribulations of the world and bring misfortune to the endless world and themselves. In a situation like this where they had to act but couldn't display too much strength, every choice they made was a choice of great importance. If they weren't careful, they might encounter a horror that they didn't want to encounter. It went without saying how oppressive this situation was. If these supreme transcendents weren't extremely familiar with the endless world and had a tacit understanding with each other, they wouldn't have been able to smoothly complete this tribulation without any mistakes. However, this kind of oppression left quite a few repercussions on their bodies. For example, when faced with the remnant effects of the battlefield that they could easily eliminate with just a single move, they actually didn't know whether they should take action or not. Forget it. Let's just wait like this. They can take care of it anyway. At most, they'll just waste a bit more time. Another supreme, transcendent sighed and said. His words received the approval of all the other supreme transcendents. Clearly, if they took action now, they would at most save a bit of time. However, the risk was so great that all of them would be killed. The rewards and risks were clearly not proportional. Since that was the case, was there any need to say more about what to do? After this conversation, the existence of these supreme transcendents became even closer to non-existent. Their influence on the fog had been weakened to the point where it was almost non-existent. Aside from the supreme transcendents at the level of 4 transcendents, the other supreme transcendents almost didn't notice their choice. The other supreme transcendents couldn't truly understand how powerful and inconceivable these supreme transcendents were. As a result, they had the wrong feeling and thought that the supreme transcendents had all died due to the series of upheavals. Only the transcendent experts at the level of the 4th tribulation clearly knew how powerful the 6th tribulation experts were after clearly sensing their own strength. They were sure that the 6th tribulation experts wouldn't suffer any real damage from the series of upheavals that happened just now. As a result, they were certain that the supreme transcendents weren't dead, but were just hiding. Although they didn't know why the supreme transcendents had been so lenient in the previous endless tribulations, the supreme transcendents weren't fools and could guess that they had no choice but to do so. As a result, they acted as if they didn't notice this and just quietly manipulated the endless existences in the fog to eliminate the remnants of the battlefield as much as possible. The remnant of the battlefield came from countless heavens and earth, so the destructive power had naturally reached an unimaginable level. It was obviously not an easy task to eliminate it. Even if the power controlled by the supreme transcendence came from countless worlds, it was the same for the supreme transcendence. However, the battlefield had already collapsed in the end. The remnants of the battlefield had become water without a source, a tree without roots. If they resisted a bit, they would weaken a bit. If they eliminated a bit, they would weaken a bit. In this way, so long as he was able to resist the first wave of impact, then it would only be a matter of time before the remnants of the battlefield were completely eliminated. For the supreme transcendence at the level of 4 transcendence, he had far too much time. As a result, he waited in this position for nearly 100,000 years. Relying on his incomparable patience, he finally eliminated all the remnants of the battlefield. When all the remnants were eliminated, this transcendent expert of the 4th tribulation level felt his body lighten. An indescribable feeling of enlightenment appeared in his heart out of nowhere. Amidst this feeling, he vaguely felt the power of his abilities, as well as his understanding of all things in the world, the endless world, and even the primordial chaos. All of them began to rise bit by bit. As all of this rose, his cultivation realm also began to rise bit by bit. After an unknown amount of time, when all of these changes ended, his cultivation realm had completely reached the peak of the 4th tribulation. In just a few 100,000 years, he had reached the peak of the 4th tribulation. The speed of his improvement was so fast that it could be said to be in defiance of the natural order. However, if one considered the gifts from passing the tribulations, this speed of improvement was only natural. Congratulations, congratulations. At this moment, a large number of 6th tribulation experts appeared before the 4th tribulation expert out of nowhere, and such words rang out. When the 4th tribulation expert heard the voices, he returned to his senses. When he saw the 6th tribulation experts, his expression became complicated. Thank you, thank you. After a long time, he sighed and suppressed all the doubts he had about them before thanking them. Chapter 3160. When the tribulations of this boundless world disappeared, every corner of the world seemed to lighten, as if a boundless burden had been lifted. At the same time, all living beings in this boundless world felt the pressure disappear completely. Compared to ordinary living beings, those who had transcended the world as participants of the endless heavenly tribulations were naturally affected much more than ordinary living beings. Ordinary living beings only felt the pressure on their bodies and spirits disappear, but the transcendent experts directly sensed that the bottleneck of their realm had loosened significantly. Using this loosening of the bottleneck, many transcendent experts who had been on the verge of a breakthrough suddenly broke through and stepped into a higher realm. Among them, there were even 3 tribulation experts who broke through their limits and became 4 tribulation experts. Moreover, there was more than one of them. In addition, there was an indescribable radiance that enveloped the entire boundless world, continuously seeping into the void and the world itself, causing the boundless world to grow stronger and more stable. This kind of change should have attracted the attention of all the supreme transcendents, but not many of them noticed it at this time, because at this moment, they were more focused on the changes that had occurred to their bodies. Compared to the changes that had occurred to their bodies, what were the changes in the outside world and the changes in all living beings? By the time they had the time to pay attention to all of this, the changes in the boundless world had already been completed. The scene of the boundless radiance covering the boundless world had also disappeared without a trace. What they saw was naturally the endless world that had already changed. However, even if they couldn't see the process of the change, just the result was enough for the transcendent experts to understand what had happened. Is this the reward for passing the tribulations? Many of the transcendent experts felt both sorrow and joy. The sorrow was that the boundless world had paid a great price in the process of the previous tribulations. Countless worlds had been destroyed. There was no need to mention the loss of living beings. The joy was that the final harvest of this sacrifice was quite considerable, as if it was enough to make up for the losses. These aren't the biggest changes. The biggest change is that the overall potential consciousness of the transcendent has fused with the boundless heavens and earth. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at the place that seemed to be in the endless branches of the island, but also didn't seem to belong to any of the island branches. Compared to those who had transcended the world and could only see the surface, he could see the true changes in the world after the endless heavenly tribulation. It was as if the heavens and the earth had been strengthened, and all living beings had benefited. All of the transcendents in the world had their cultivation increased. All of this seemed to be a huge benefit. But in reality, these benefits were only on the surface and not the essence. The real essential change was in the relationship between the consciousness of those who had transcended and the boundless world. Before the calamity, the transcendent consciousness had gained the absolute upper hand in the endless heaven and earth, even suppressing Luo Fan's authority in the endless heaven and earth, allowing the endless heaven and earth to gain freedom and independence. However, it was actually more like a computer with an additional operating system installed. And now, after all these changes, the relationship between the consciousness and the endless heaven and earth had clearly surpassed the relationship between an operating system and a computer. It was equivalent to using hardware to directly fix the operation. If it was an operating system, then reinstalling the system could directly delete it. But if it was fixed in hardware, then unless the hardware was completely destroyed, there was no way to affect the operating system. Placed here, even now, this entire hidden consciousness had already become an inseparable attribute of this endless world. In the past, if one wanted to destroy this consciousness, they only needed to kill all the transcendents in the world. But now, if they wanted to destroy this hidden consciousness, even if they killed all the transcendents, it was no longer possible to do so. They had to wipe out the endless heaven and earth, and only then could the consciousness disappear completely. This change was the greatest change in the endless heaven and earth after the endless heavenly tribulation. And with this change, this meant that the consciousness had actually become the heavenly Tao of the endless heaven and earth at this time, as the relationship between the consciousness and the endless heaven and earth became more and more harmonious. The consciousness gradually began to make some subtle adjustments to the endless heaven and earth. Under this adjustment, the position of the endless heaven and earth in the void began to change subtly. This kind of change was not too obvious for a specific part of the endless heaven and earth. At most, the position of the endless heaven and earth slightly shifted a few places. Such a shift was naturally shocking to the perspective of ordinary living beings. But for the endless heaven and earth itself, it was quite ordinary. It felt like a person had only moved a small step to the side. And when these small shifts gathered together, they completely changed the appearance of the endless heaven and earth. Originally, the distribution of the endless heaven and earth was almost random. The relationship between the endless heaven and earth was closer than the relationship between the endless heaven and earth and the other endless heaven and earth, but only in a slightly different degree. The relationship between the endless heaven and earth was quite chaotic. For example, complementing, communicating, promoting each other, resonating, breathing together, sharing each other's burden, and so on and so forth. These kinds of relationships were not really reflected. Looking at the endless heaven and earth, there was only one word: chaos. This situation made the endless heaven and earth seem natural, but also greatly wasted the potential of the endless heaven and earth. As a result, the many possibilities that should have promoted each other and complemented each other could not be reflected. But now, as the consciousness of the whole body truly fused with the endless heaven and earth, it truly had the authority to adjust all the endless heaven and earth, and this phenomenon began to change. Although the changes in each part of the endless heaven and earth were very small, it was these small changes that gathered together that caused the overall appearance of the endless heaven and earth to undergo an earth-shattering change. The effects that required too large a change in form could not appear because of this adjustment. But the changes that did not require too large a change in position were enough to greatly stimulate the potential of the entire endless heaven and earth. At this moment, every part of the endless heaven and earth started to form various systems with the other parts of the endless heaven and earth. They either resonated with each other, or shared the pressure and power of the endless heaven and earth together, or split up and absorbed some mixed existences, causing the mixed existences that were originally harmful to the endless heaven and earth to be purified and become nutrients for the endless heaven and earth's growth. On the whole, the endless heaven and earth seemed to show some kind of indescribable subtle order, and the original sense of chaos was swept away in the blink of an eye. Of course, this adjustment was still going on. Right now, the adjustment was only limited to an extremely small change in position, and this change was clearly very limited. If one wanted to truly unleash the potential of the endless heaven and earth, they clearly needed to get rid of this restriction. If one wanted to get rid of this restriction, they would naturally need to spend enough time. Moreover, during this process of adjustment, there would also be a large number of new transcendents appearing in the endless heaven and earth. Once they appeared, they would clearly need to be within the overall system of the endless heaven and earth. In other words, the overall system of the endless heaven and earth needed to be adjusted once more. Only then could the endless heaven and earth regain that kind of order. With this, it could be said that this kind of adjustment would be an endless kind of adjustment. It could be said that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many adjustments were made, it would not be able to truly reach perfection. There were quite a few transcendent transcendents who were able to notice such a change on a macroscopic scale. However, they did not know that this was their overall hidden consciousness adjusting the endless heaven and earth. They only thought that this was some kind of reward that the endless heaven and earth obtained after the endless heaven and earth tribulation. From a certain point of view, this guess was also correct. After all, the reason why this consciousness was able to adjust the position and angle of the boundless world was because the boundless world had survived the boundless tribulation of the heavens and earth. In other words, it was reasonable to remove the changes in the middle and attribute all the credit to the boundless world tribulation. The endless heaven and earth is getting better and better. In this case, their sacrifice will not be in vain. This kind of thought emerged in the minds of more and more transcendents. With this thought in mind, they became more and more at ease with the world and fellow Taoists that they had lost in the endless heavenly tribulation. Just as the internal situation of these island branches was changing in the outside world, which was the nothingness ocean of the sixth layer of the Tao Master's Road, the island branches suddenly seemed to completely merge with the surrounding nothingness ocean under a strange flash of light and shadow. There was a faint charm that was born from the nothingness ocean. This charm made the island branches seem as if they had existed in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean since ancient times. Because of this change, the branches of the islands became less conspicuous. Even though it was like a behemoth that stretched across billions of layers of the nothingness ocean and was still connecting more and more layers of the nothingness ocean, it was still the same. The cultivators who had not paid attention to these island branches before now found it very difficult to find them among the countless strange cultivation places on the sixth layer of the Tao Master's Road. After all, these island branches had already disappeared into the world and looked like a very ordinary cultivation place on the sixth layer of the Tao Master's Road, or rather, a natural wonder. It was like a naturally born mountain. Even if it was larger, more majestic, and more magnificent than ordinary man-made objects, it was much more difficult to find this mountain from space than to find a man-made object that was much smaller than this mountain. Previously, these countless island branches were like relatively large man-made objects, or rather, man-made miracles. Naturally, it was easy to find them and easily attract the attention of many sixth tribulation experts. But now, these island branches seem to have turned into naturally formed mountains. Although they were much larger than the man-made miracle and the landscape was also much more magnificent, it was much more difficult to find them. However, this was only the case for the sixth tribulation experts who had not paid attention to these island branches before. For those 6 tribulation powerhouses who had been paying attention to this island branch before, the change of this island branch instantly gathered their attention. It was like an observer who had placed his attention on a man-made miracle. Once he discovered that the man-made miracle had suddenly turned into a natural landscape, like a mountain, a natural creation, it was self-evident how he would feel. And how many 6 tribulation experts had noticed these island branches before? The number had already exceeded Luo Fan's original estimate of the number of 6 tribulation experts on the 6th layer of the Tao Master's Road. In the beginning, it was precisely because he noticed that the number of 6 tribulation experts who paid attention to these island branches was much more than he had estimated that there might be all 6 tribulation experts on the 6th layer of the Tao Master's Road. As a result, he had a deeper understanding of the mystery of the Tao Master's Road. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how many 6 tribulation experts were paying attention to these island branches at this time, because of the changes in these island branches. In just an instant, the layer of nothingness around these island branches became slightly distorted because of the countless attention. Chapter 31:61. Those who paid attention to the branches of the islands were not ordinary people. They were at least 6 tribulation experts. And the existence of 6 tribulation experts, even their sight and attention, had all kinds of incredible power. Now, although the number of 6 tribulation powerhouses paying attention to these island branches did not increase by much, because of the transformation of these island branches from man-made objects to natural objects, the attention of those 6 tribulation powerhouses on these island branches naturally increased by many times in an instant. And this increase was enough to cause many incredible effects in an instant. In the end, it caused all kinds of subtle distortions in the layer of the nothingness ocean around the branches of the islands. This sort of change might seem inconceivable, but if one were to look deeper into it, it would be completely natural. Thinking, no matter how high or low one's level was, had power. Even ordinary creatures had a very obvious embodiment of the power of thinking. For example, the existence of belief in the gods was obviously the most intuitive embodiment of the power of thinking of ordinary creatures. The foundation of the existence of belief in the gods was the belief of all living beings. And the belief of all living beings, in essence, was obviously a certain kind of power of thinking of all living beings. The gathering of the belief of all living beings to give birth to the gods was equivalent to the gathering of a certain kind of power of thinking of all living beings to give birth to the gods. From this, it could be seen that the power of thinking was a real existence. And the higher the level, the more powerful the power of thinking would be. Ordinary creatures might need the power of thinking of tens of thousands or even millions of individuals to gather together to form a weak gods. And powerful creatures, with just a thought, might be able to distort time and space, distort the world, distort the rules, and distort the great way. And obviously, no matter from which point of view, 6 tribulation experts were definitely strengthening the rules. In this way, it could be imagined how strong the power of thinking of 6 tribulation experts was. And the sight and attention of those 6 tribulation experts were naturally entrusted to the thinking of those 6 tribulation experts, carrying the powerful power of thinking. This level of power, in an ordinary environment, was probably enough to distort time and space, forming all kinds of incredible phenomena. Facing the nothingness ocean in the 6th layer of the road to Tao Master, this level of power was naturally nothing. It was still quite difficult to shake the nothingness ocean. Therefore, before the total amount of this power gathered reached a certain level, it did not produce too many strange phenomena. However, it was clear that the situation was no longer the same as before. The current situation was that every 6th tribulation expert's attention towards this branch of the island had greatly increased. In other words, the power of their thoughts and their gazes and senses had greatly increased. At the same time, their various mental powers also resonated with each other due to the fluctuations caused by the abnormal changes on the island branch, and they connected as one. Their mental powers communicated and interacted with each other, and in the end, they turned into a collective force that manifested as a result. In the end, this strange distortion appeared around the countless branches of the islands. It was also because of this distortion that countless Six Tribulation experts discovered the existence of other Taoists who were also paying attention to these island branches. This discovery allowed them to confirm that the changes to the island branch were real and not some illusion or illusion. After confirming the reality of this scene, it was enough for those Six Tribulation experts to send their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections from all over the sixth layer of the road to Town Master to the various island branches. Of course, although they discovered that so many Taoists were paying attention to these island branches, because the cognitive shackles of the road to Town Master still existed in the hearts of many Six Tribulation experts. Even if they had a rough estimate of the number of Six Tribulation experts who were paying attention to these island branches, they still did not really link it with the abnormal number of Six Tribulation experts on the sixth layer of the road to Town Master. That was to say, strictly speaking, the number of Six Tribulations experts who were paying attention to the situation on the islands at the same time was actually more than the total number of Six Tribulations experts in the sixth layer of the Town Master's road. However, none of the Six Tribulations experts really changed their thinking in this direction. At this time, at most, they were shocked by the eye-catching changes on those island branches, but they did not really explore the contradiction between the facts and cognition behind it. After all, not every practitioner was able to break through the cognitive shackles set by the road to Town Master like Luo Fan. Fellow Taoist is also here. In a certain layer of the nothingness ocean, the doppelgangers of two Six Tribulation experts met, and one of them said to the other. In fact, this kind of thing happened in almost every layer of the nothingness ocean. Moreover, it happened more than once in each layer of the nothingness ocean. The exploration range of a Six Tribulation expert was not comparable to that of an ordinary practitioner. On the other hand, if they were to explore a wide area, the chances of them crossing paths with each other would naturally be much higher than that of ordinary cultivators. Therefore, the proportion of those Six Tribulation experts who knew each other was quite large. Now that so many Six Tribulation experts had sent their doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections to these island branches at the same time, it was naturally not strange at all for Six Tribulation experts to know each other in front of the same target. Of course, to be accepted by the road to Town Master with a cultivator's creation and obtain the same status as a natural creation on the road to Town Master, I'm afraid he wouldn't still be in this sixth layer, right? Another person replied at this time. Hearing this, the first person who spoke smiled slightly and said, "Indeed, if we hadn't paid attention to this place before, we would have almost missed this opportunity, just like the other fortuitous encounters that we've missed." At the end of his sentence, his smile was slightly bitter. In fact, the last sentence was the fundamental reason why he and many other Six Tribulation experts were so proactive in sending doppelgangers, incarnations, and projections to explore these island branches. This was because the island branch's transformation from a man-made object to a natural object was simply too natural and hidden. It made them doubt the various cultivation grounds that they were currently exploring that seemed to be natural landscapes and natural objects. In the end, these natural landscapes and cultivation places that they were exploring were natural from the beginning. Were they natural landscapes and cultivation places derived from the road to Town Master, or were they originally man-made? Or were they also some kind of cultivation places or places to verify cultivation opened by a cultivator, but later, due to various subtle changes, they finally transformed into the natural landscapes and natural creations? And this kind of doubt was obviously enough to affect their cultivation and exploration process in the natural landscapes that they were originally exploring. As a result, they had to spare some energy to go to these island branches, hoping to find some evidence from these island branches that could prove their doubts or dispel their doubts. Of course, it couldn't be better if they knew how to achieve this effect in the process and could turn the creation created by a cultivator into a natural creation. At this time, a huge number of Six Tribulation experts gathered, and the island branches, no matter which layer of nothingness they were in, were no longer as lonely as before. These island branches simply seem to have become the center of the sixth layer of the road to Town Master, and even those heavens seem to be inferior to these island branches in terms of status. After all, those heavens were owned by every cultivator, and they were relatively independent and scattered. In contrast, the island branches that were distributed in countless layers of nothingness were concentrated, and the number of six tribulation experts that gathered around them could only be counted in the trillions. Comparing the two, there is no need to say who was the center of the sixth layer of the road to Town Master, and who was the center of all the six tribulation experts. At this time, the shadow of the world of laws that ran through countless layers of nothingness could no longer be compared to these island branches. Although the shadow of the world of laws was wonderful, and although it could bring considerable benefits to the six tribulation experts who sent their avatars, incarnations, and projections into it because of Luo Fan's arrangement, it was still a creation of a cultivator and was only the means of a seventh tribulation expert. No matter what, the benefits that it could bring to a sixth tribulation powerhouse were only benefits that a cultivator could give. In contrast, the situation of these countless island branches was completely different. Now, although it was unknown why, the island branches had clearly become a natural creation, a natural landscape. In this case, the benefits that it could bring to explorers and researchers were obviously at the level that the natural landscape of the road to Town Master could give. This was clearly above the limit of what a single cultivator could give. Even if that cultivator was a seventh tribulation expert, it would not be an exception. In addition, compared to the island branches, the shadow of the world of laws still lacked a key significance. The key significance of exploring the mysteries of the transformation between natural and man-made objects. This point made the attention that the island branches received turn defeat into victory, and even surpassed the shadow of the world of laws that ran through countless layers of nothingness. Obviously, this was a huge surprise for Luo Fan. Although the fundamental purpose was not to attract six tribulation experts, this ability to attract six tribulation experts obviously showed the mysterious degree of these two creations to a certain extent. In order to build the shadow of the world of laws that ran through countless layers of nothingness, Luo Fan sent an almost endless number of incarnations into it. It could be said that the number of the shadow of the world of laws that he had sent into this creation was equivalent to the number of incarnations. But now, the number of the shadow of the world of laws had exceeded trillions of incarnations. In other words, at the very least, in order to support the existence of the shadow of the world of laws, Luo Fan had invested trillions of incarnations into it. Moreover, this number began to rise crazily with the passage of time. In Luo Fan's heavens, the incarnations of the nebula still existed, and its scale seemed to be constantly increasing. In another location, in the island branches, how many incarnations did Luo Fan put in? That's right, only one. In the island branches, from the beginning, Luo Fan had only put in one incarnation, and it was left here because it would be a waste to take it back. It was just a dispensable incarnation. One had invested trillions of incarnations, while the other had only one incarnation. The gap between Luo Fan's expectations for the two was self-evident. It could be said that in the group of shadow of the world of laws, Luo Fan had placed great expectations on them. But in this branch of the island, Luo Fan only had the mentality of playing around without a date. However, the final result was that the group of heaven and earth phantoms that Luo Fan had placed almost all of his expectations on, which made him put almost all of his attention and energy into, was instead overtaken by the island branch that had only hit a date without hitting a date. Its attraction to the many sixth tribulation powerhouses was far surpassed by it. The disparity between the investment and the result was enough to show the impermanence of the world and the mystery of creation. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan also felt a little dumbfounded. However, even so, he did not feel that his choice was wrong. He did not feel that he had invested too few incarnations in the island branches and too many incarnations in the shadow of the world of laws. After all, the purpose of creating the two was completely different. The island branches were just some kind of cultivation place that he had built according to the characteristics of the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. All the results that he had achieved here were only a very small part of it. The real reason for this incredible change was actually the Tao Master's Road, the 6th level of the Tao Master's Road. And the countless shadows of the world of laws were a kind of cultivation place that he had built completely according to his own inspiration. Everything here was built according to his own ideas and his own understanding. Here, the goal that he wanted to achieve was not to further improve his cultivation realm, but to thoroughly understand the corresponding functional relationship between the great way of heaven and earth and the rules and principles. This difference in purpose caused him to be unexpectedly calm now. Chapter 3162. At this time, there were a large number of 6th tribulation powerhouses densely surrounding the countless island branches. These 6th tribulation powerhouses called their friends, and it didn't take long for them to form small groups based on their relationship with each other. Although these 6th tribulation powerhouses didn't have a specific 6th tribulation powerhouse who had a wide circle of friends and had a good relationship with the other 6th tribulation powerhouses within a group. However, as long as the 6th tribulation powerhouses weren't isolated and had more or less contact with other 6th tribulation powerhouses, this was actually enough for them to form small groups one after another. For example, if you knew someone but didn't know another person, but that person knew that other person, then you would naturally have a foundation to build a friendship with that other person. The depth of this foundation depended on how much you trusted that person. With such a foundation, the three of you would naturally be able to build an extremely small group. In this way, the size of this small group would have infinite possibilities. It could even form a huge monster. The reason why these small groups were built was because these 6 tribulation powerhouses clearly knew the uniqueness of this island branch and understood that this island branch had attracted the attention of many 6 tribulation powerhouses. Under such a background, their opponents were actually no longer those island branches, but other 6 tribulation powerhouses. Once the enemy became other people of the same kind, then naturally forming a group was their natural choice. After all, forming a group could first move a portion of the same kind away from the position of competitors. If they formed a group, then their interests would naturally be initially connected and naturally wouldn't be the same kind of competitors as before. Secondly, if they formed a group, it would also greatly increase the competitiveness of their own side. In most cases, the side with more people would be able to occupy an advantageous position in the competition. There was no doubt about this. With these 2 points, it was enough for these 6 tribulation powerhouses to form groups of various sizes. This choice was the common choice of most 6 tribulation powerhouses. Therefore, around any island branch, such groups of various sizes were endless. Although there were still some 6 tribulation powerhouses who didn't join any group, they were already very few. Moreover, they more or less had some special ideas. For example, they felt that they had a certain secret that they couldn't be discovered by others. For example, they felt that they had a certain treasure that shouldn't be known by other 6 tribulation experts. For example, they had a special exploration method that they didn't want other 6 tribulation experts to know. After forming these large and small groups, these 6 tribulation experts no longer hesitated. After all, while they were busy, the number of islands that branched off had increased again, and the number of void layers they were involved in had also increased significantly. This was enough to show that the speed at which the situation on the island was changing was beyond their imagination. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for them to explore these island branches at the same slow pace as when they explored other places of cultivation in the past. Immediately, they began to attempt to step into the branches of the islands. Compared to the previous 6 tribulation experts, their luck was quite good. After going through the tribulation of the heavens and earth, it no longer rejected any 6 tribulation experts from entering. Although this wasn't the time when the island branches would open up to the next branch, these 6 tribulation experts didn't encounter any obstacles that should have appeared. They easily stepped into those island branches and stepped into the first layer of the island branches. Although the islands had become a single entity from another perspective, becoming a boundless world, The truth was that the vision of any being who had yet to transcend the world was clearly limited to the individual islands. In other words, after entering the island branch, they would only be able to see the first layer of the world. Once they passed through the first layer, they would only be able to see the second layer, the third layer, the fourth layer, all the way to the deepest part of the island branch, the nothingness beneath all the worlds. Apart from that, they could only confirm the existence of the other island branches from the memories of those outside of the island branches. If only a few Sixth Tribulation experts stepped into these island branches like before, or rather, the endless world, then the impact on the endless world would naturally be extremely weak. After all, the number of worlds in the endless world had reached a terrifying scale that couldn't be described with numbers. Compared to such a huge group, just a few Sixth Tribulation experts were nothing. With the power of this huge body, they could easily suppress them and make them act obediently according to the rules of the body. However, it was clear that the current situation was completely different from what it was before. At this time, the number of Sixth Tribulation experts that had stepped into the endless world was simply too many. In terms of numbers, the number of Sixth Tribulation experts was not much less than the number of transcendents that existed in this boundless world. It must be known that after a long period of development, the number of transcendents in the endless world had reached a terrifying number that could be calculated in the hundreds of trillions. With so many transcendents, they had even formed a hidden consciousness, directly suppressing Luo Fan's control over these island branches and the endless world. Now, the number of Sixth Tribulation experts that were not much less than this number had entered the endless world. One could imagine how strong the impact on the endless world was. With so many Sixth Tribulation experts entering the endless world, the atmosphere of the endless world unknowingly underwent a huge change. An indescribably grand will appeared out of nowhere in the endless world, faintly beginning to attack the control that the transcendents had over the endless world. Because of the appearance of this grand will, countless parts of the endless world underwent all sorts of inconceivable changes. The will of the world itself, the rules of the world, and even the great doubt directly distorted, becoming incomparably intimate to the Sixth Tribulation experts. The various rules and regulations that the transcendents had originally set up seemed to not exist in these endless world, completely unable to have any effect. It seems that the endless world has undergone a huge change after the tribulations. Compared to the bewilderment of the native-born transcendent experts, the Sixth Tribulation transcendent experts obviously knew more. At this time, the one who spoke was clearly a transcendent expert at the Sixth Tribulation level. The person he was talking to wasn't another Sixth Tribulation cultivator, but a transcendent Fourth Tribulation cultivator who had come to ask for advice. He was also the first transcendent Fourth Tribulation cultivator in this world. "Fellow, please enlighten me," the Fourth Tribulation expert hurriedly asked for guidance. The Sixth Tribulation expert smiled slightly. He did not directly state the reason for his judgment. Instead, he directly asked the Fourth Tribulation expert, "Fellow, do you know why we always call the endless world countless island branches?" It's said that the endless world can be divided into countless groups, and each group is a so-called island branch. The Fourth Tribulation expert was slightly stunned. Although he was extremely anxious about the endless world's current situation, he still braced himself and replied. After all, no matter what, he was asking for guidance from a Sixth Tribulation expert. Whether the other party wanted to say it or not would depend on his mood. Under these circumstances, he naturally could not just ignore the Sixth Tribulation expert. "Then do you know why it's called island branches and not something else, such as the Heaven and Earth group?" The Sixth Tribulation expert smiled faintly. "I do not know about that." A hint of confusion appeared on the Fourth Tribulation expert's face. Indeed, this was a question that all the transcendents who had been born and raised in the endless world had. However, this didn't affect their survival and cultivation much, so they didn't care too much about it. They just treated it as a form of pride in the hearts of the Sixth Tribulation powerhouses. In essence, it was just like how they looked down on those who were limited to a single island and treated that island as the entire world. When faced with such beings, did they not just tell them that they were only on an island? Perhaps, to those six tribulation experts, this boundless world was actually just a bunch of islands. The reason why we call those worlds island branches is because when you look at them from the endless world, they really are just branches of an island, the six tribulation experts said indifferently. Hearing this, the fourth tribulation expert trembled slightly. Previously, when they said that the endless world was just an island in the eyes of the six tribulation experts, they were just mocking themselves. It was like living on an island. They felt that their island was the inhabitants of the entire world. No matter how they thought about it, they would not think that the boundless continent they resided on was just an island. As transcendents who were born and raised in the endless world, they would not think that the endless world that they had struggled for billions of years was just an island in the eyes of the outside world. How was that possible? The fourth tribulation expert instinctively retorted. That is the truth. From the outside world's perspective, the endless world does not actually exist. In the eyes of the living beings in the outside world, there are only many branches of the island. Although the distribution of these island branches is quite strange, they are just branches of an island. Within the branches of the island, there were layers upon layers of heaven and earth. These layers of worlds are the originally separated groups of worlds, the six tribulation experts said. This was actually not a secret. The six tribulation experts did not think of this as a secret that could allow them to control the native cultivators. The reason why the native cultivators were only told now, after the endless world had such a long history, was because the six tribulation experts were not interested in explaining it to the native cultivators. It really is an island, and a branch of an island at that. I didn't think that we would also be frogs at the bottom of a well. The transcendent expert, who was at the fourth tribulation level, was not ordinary. He had already regained his composure. In fact, he did not suspect that the sixth tribulation expert was lying from the start. After all, the sixth tribulation expert had no reason to lie to him. The sixth tribulation expert had only retorted instinctively because he was unable to accept the truth that overturned his worldview. Now that it had truly calmed down, he naturally would not deny the truth like before. The fourth tribulation expert sighed and asked, so the current situation is that the experts outside the island saw the changes inside the island branches and became interested in exploring this place, so they entered to explore? The sixth tribulation expert smiled and said, That's right. Although I don't know how big of a change it is to attract so many fellow cultivators, it should be caused by the tribulation of the endless world. The sixth tribulation cultivator smiled. The fourth tribulation expert asked, The world that has been completely distorted now should be the first layer of the island branches, right? The fourth tribulation expert was able to deduce many things from one instance. For a transcendent expert like the fourth tribulation expert, this was something that was almost instinctive. Thus, even if the sixth tribulation expert did not explain, he could still guess the truth. Most of them should be. Of course, a small portion should be a deeper layer of the world. The sixth tribulation expert looked at the fourth tribulation expert with an appreciative gaze and smiled. I didn't expect there to be so many branches. It seems that the outside world is even grander than I imagined. The fourth tribulation expert smiled bitterly, but his eyes showed an indescribable desire. At this time, the number of worlds that were distorted by the six tribulation experts had to be counted in the trillions. If these worlds were the first layer of an island branch, then it meant that the number of island branches outside also had to be counted in the trillions. Trillions of islands and branches. Just how massive was that? Yet, this was only a slightly conspicuous cluster of islands in the outside world. One could imagine just how massive the outside world was. In addition, the terrifying six tribulation experts that were attracted from the outside world caused the fourth tribulation expert to imagine the vastness of the outside world even more. In this way, his estimation of the outside world had naturally increased by countless times. Although the fourth tribulation expert had stayed in the endless world due to his previous psychological struggle, it did not mean that he did not have a desire for the wider world outside. It was only because of his reluctance to part with the endless world that he suppressed this desire and stayed. Chapter 3163. but wouldn't want a brighter future and broader prospects. For those experts who had undergone the fourth tribulation, the boundless world clearly represented a broader and brighter future. A place that could treat the boundless world as an island with countless branches, a place that could casually send countless experts who had undergone the sixth tribulation into the boundless world. It went without saying how vast and bright it was. Under such circumstances, how could they not desire to step into it, and not desire to enjoy the wider space it would bring them to move forward? However, because he cared more about the endless world and was more reluctant to leave, he only sighed with emotion and longed for it. But he didn't take any action to find a way to step into the outside world. Then what is their goal? After a while, the fourth tribulation expert recovered and asked the sixth tribulation expert for guidance. Of course, their goal is the same as ours. It's for the secret of this island branch. The sixth tribulation expert didn't hide anything and told his guess to the fourth tribulation expert. If that's the case, then they might not necessarily be our enemies. The fourth tribulation expert heaved a sigh of relief. If they had the same goal as the sixth tribulation experts who had entered the island branch or the endless world, then they would obviously be the same as the sixth tribulation experts who had entered the endless world. They would also be assimilated by the endless world, assimilated by the transcendence, and eventually become one of them. If things really developed in this way, their entry might not be a disaster for the endless heavens and earth. Instead, it would be a rare opportunity for development. Of course, they're not your enemies. They don't care about you at all, the sixth tribulation expert said indifferently. His words caused the fourth tribulation expert's expression to stiffen slightly. At this time, he also remembered how the sixth tribulation experts had treated them back then. Back then, they had been developing in this boundless world for billions of years. Only when all the transcendents had truly established their footing in this boundless world did they discover that there were still unimaginably powerful experts like the sixth tribulation in this boundless world. Before that, even though the sixth tribulation experts had appeared around them countless times, they still ignored them. In fact, even if they discovered these sixth tribulation experts, they would have to wait for countless years until they gradually matured. Only after these sixth tribulation experts had become transcendents for a long period of time and gradually interacted with other transcendents did they barely manage to assimilate into the group of transcendents. Even so, even now, there was a deep barrier between the transcendent transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation experts and the native transcendent transcendents. It was as if there was a huge chasm dividing them into two groups. If that wasn't the case, why would he come here to ask these six tribulation experts about those foreign experts? Those six tribulation experts had already taken the initiative to explain to them. They had even taken the initiative to go and deal with the foreign experts. Even these six tribulation experts, who had lived in this boundless world for billions of years, were like this. Was there any need to say more about the attitude of those six tribulation experts from the outside? It could be said that they were cultured to treat these native-born transcendents coldly. It was normal for them to treat them like ants to experiment on, kill, and distort. Thinking of this, the fourth tribulation expert's expression became unsightly. Looks like I have to have a good conversation with them. He muttered to himself and looked at the sixth tribulation expert. Suddenly, he had an idea and asked, "Fellow Taoist, may I ask what your attitude is regarding this matter?" Attitude? As long as they don't disturb me, I don't care what they do. That must be the attitude of the other Taoists, said the transcendent indifferently. So that's how it is. This way, I can rest assured. The transcendent expert heaved a sigh of relief. The sixth tribulation expert was slightly startled. He had clearly said that he didn't care about the survival of these natives. Why was he so relaxed? Is there something I've overlooked? He asked the fourth tribulation expert. To a transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level, he was the absolute expert in this boundless world. As an absolute expert, he naturally didn't need to conceal himself, whether it was his own doubts or his attitude. As such, he had some doubts in his heart, so he didn't hesitate to ask the fourth tribulation cultivator. The fourth tribulation expert smiled and said, "Because fellow Taoist is already completely fused with the endless world." As long as they destroy the endless world, they will naturally disturb you fellow Taoists. In that case, you fellow Taoists won't just sit by and watch. Fuse? The sixth tribulation expert was startled. Then, his expression slightly changed. It was at this moment that he realized that the connection between his world and the vast ocean of nothingness in the outside world seemed to have weakened a little. Although it wasn't much, this weakening clearly represented a trend that definitely wasn't good for him. Previously, he only felt that this weakening was due to the flow of time and the endless world's evolution. After all, the endless world's evolution never stopped. At every moment, he could feel that this kind of communication was changing. The connection would suddenly strengthen and suddenly weaken. These situations would occur every once in a while. Therefore, he had unknowingly treated this sudden weakening as a process of the endless world's evolution and ignored it. However, after receiving the reminder from the fourth tribulation expert, he discovered that this weakening was slightly different from the weakening caused by the natural evolution of the world. This weakening was even more abrupt and also a bit faster. Clearly, there was something different from the endless world's evolution that affected this change. And at this moment, it was obvious that the six tribulation experts that didn't exist before were the factors that affected this change. In other words, it was the large number of six tribulation experts that entered the endless world that caused this weakening. This, and what he had neglected before, was that he already had a rather close integration with the endless world. This was clearly in line with each other. Looks like I've also been blinded by a leaf. Forget it. I can't let them take action as they wish. I have to communicate with them first. The sixth tribulation expert sighed. Previously, he hadn't discovered this influence, so he could naturally watch calmly from the sidelines. But now that he had confirmed the existence of this influence, he naturally couldn't remain calm anymore. After all, although it seemed that it had only affected the endless world a little, it only weakened the connection a little. However, this was clearly only because the six tribulation experts had just entered the endless world and hadn't taken any of the big actions. If they really took the actions that the six tribulation experts would take when facing an unfamiliar place, the influence obviously wouldn't be so small. At that time, this kind of communication might be completely cut off. Once this kind of communication was cut off, how could he rely on this kind of communication to continuously strengthen his foundation? How could he rely on this kind of communication to work hard to increase his chances of breaking through? With a slight thought, a large amount of information followed his thoughts to the other worlds. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread to the hearts of countless six tribulation experts. This kind of matter was related to the interests of all the six tribulation experts who had transcended the world. Naturally, they couldn't just rely on the six tribulation experts themselves to deal with it. Of course, all the six tribulation experts involved had to be involved. As this information passed, a tremendous aura burst out from the endless world. It instantly spread to every inch of the void, to every corner of the world. We can't let them do what they want. We have to set some rules with them. They have to follow the rules we set. Many thoughts reverberated between the heavens and earth, representing the agitated state of mind of those six tribulation powerhouses. It's done. At this time, the transcendent expert who had transcended the four tribulations finally relaxed. Although he was the strongest among the indigenous transcendent experts, in fact, in the entire endless world, he was actually just a relatively large ant. The truly powerful ones, the ones who could stand on equal footing with the six tribulation experts, were the transcendent experts of the six tribulation level. If they relied on themselves, it would be equivalent to relying on some ants to negotiate with the giant dragon and set rules for the giant dragon. The difficulty of that was self-evident. However, the situation would be different if the transcendent transcendents of the sixth tribulation level were to act against them. There were also giant dragons. It was very suitable for giant dragons to set rules for giant dragons. At least, it was many times more suitable than them, who were ants setting rules for giant dragons. Because of this, when he discovered that these transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation had finally decided to take action, he naturally relaxed. You can go back. You don't need to worry about what happens next. The sixth tribulation expert directly said to the fourth tribulation expert after receiving the feedback from his fellow Taoists. Hearing this, the fourth tribulation expert bowed to the sixth tribulation expert and said, "I'll leave the rest to you." With that, he didn't stay any longer and returned to his own world. Then, he communicated with the other transcendent experts. Naturally, there was no need to say more. In short, with his return, the transcendent experts calmed down a lot. At the very least, they weren't as anxious as before. After that, the transcending experts of the sixth tribulation level began to appear in the first layer of the island branches. There were simply too many branches on the island, tens of thousands of times more than the number of transcendent experts at the level of sixth tribulation. Even if every transcendent of the sixth tribulation realm spread out and entered the first layer of different islands, there would still be tens of thousands of times more transcendent of the sixth tribulation realm in the first layer of the island. In this way, the workload of these transcendents at the level of the sixth tribulation was quite heavy. As for not personally entering those endless world and communicating with the sixth tribulation experts, it was clearly impossible. After all, those sixth tribulation experts were sixth tribulation experts. They weren't any weaker than them. Some were even stronger than them. Under such circumstances, you directly used voice transmission to inform them from afar. What do you mean? Do you think your status is much higher than theirs? Do you think they're afraid of your power? Do you think they'll obediently listen to your words? Obviously, if you don't personally appear, communicate with them, and persuade them, those sixth tribulation experts obviously won't follow their rules. At least, most sixth tribulation experts won't follow their rules. In this way, even though the number of transcendents at the level of sixth tribulation was thousands of times less than the number of worlds that required them to enter, they had no choice but to personally step into those worlds and directly face those sixth tribulation transcendents. Even if it would greatly increase their workload, forcing them to make the best use of their time, they still had to do it. Are you the Taoist who came in before? The moment they appeared, they were immediately discovered by those sixth tribulation experts. Not all the sixth tribulation experts remembered every single sixth tribulation expert who had stepped into these islands before. Even if they remembered every single one of them, with so many sixth tribulation experts in the world, the sudden appearance of one more sixth tribulation expert would only be noticed by a small portion of them. It was impossible for almost everyone to notice them. The reason why they were so easily discovered was that after entering this endless world for such a long time, the aura of these sixth tribulation experts had already been assimilated by this endless world. There was already a clear difference between them and the sixth tribulation experts from the endless world. Poster, share. Chapter 3164. This difference caused them to feel like a drop of water falling in a boiling oil the moment they stepped in. The world that had been distorted by the numerous sixth tribulation experts instantly reacted intensely. This reaction was so intense that ordinary creatures could not sense it, but for the sixth tribulation experts, it was like a clap of thunder ringing in their ears. Naturally, they noticed their existence in an instant. It was precisely because of this that they immediately discovered the existence of a sixth tribulation transcendent expert. Numerous gazes converged on him. The transcendent experts of the sixth tribulation level were naturally aware of this change, so they were not nervous at all. They smiled at the newcomers and explained the situation of the boundless world to them in their own ways. Of course, different experts had different personalities. With different personalities, the details of what they said were also different. However, no matter what, they still let the new sixth tribulation experts understand the benefits of the endless world. So that's how it is. Communicating with the void ocean is indeed worthy of being a man-made creation that is transformed into a natural creation. A sixth tribulation expert sighed with eagerness in his eyes. Before they entered the island branches, they wanted to explore the root cause of the island branches transforming from man-made to natural. However, this did not mean that they would reject the benefits that the island branches could bring them. In an instant, their thoughts naturally changed. All kinds of destructive experiments that originally existed in their minds were immediately eliminated by them. It must be known that different six tribulation experts had different personalities. With different personalities, they would naturally have different methods of researching something. Destructive experiments were just a very normal choice for them. Now, that so many six tribulation experts had entered the endless world, there were too many six tribulation experts who were prepared to carry out destructive experiments. If these transcendents at the level of six tribulation hadn't come to explain the benefits of this boundless world to them, the boundless world might have suffered even more damage than the tribulation of heaven and earth had done to this boundless world in a very short time. Of course, dangers still existed at this time. After all, the number of transcending experts at the six tribulation level was simply too few. Compared to the number of branches on those islands, it was still thousands of times less. At this moment, they were extremely fast. It would still take time for them to travel through the first layer of the island branches. The time they needed to travel through these worlds was obviously an opportunity for those six tribulation experts who wanted to carry out destructive experiments. Because they understood this point, the transcending experts of the six tribulation level cherished their time very much. They only explained the things that needed to be explained. After confirming that the six tribulation experts had understood what they were talking about, they directly bid farewell and left for the first layer of the other islands to continue with the next round of explanations. In just a few hours, they each walked through thousands of worlds and explained what they needed to explain to the foreign six tribulation powerhouses in those worlds. It told them that there might be benefits in the endless world that were extremely important to six tribulation experts. However, no matter how fast they rushed, they were still a step too late. The destructive experiments of many six tribulation experts had finally begun. Before they arrived, hundreds of thousands of worlds had already completely collapsed under the destructive experiments of the six tribulation experts and transformed into all kinds of strange forms. If it was in the past, as long as Luo Fan didn't deal with this kind of destruction, there naturally wouldn't be any other consequences. However, the current situation was clearly completely different from before. Now, the endless world already had a consciousness similar to the heavenly Tao. The existence of this consciousness was enough to make the endless world react violently to this kind of unbridled destruction. After the six tribulation experts carried out all kinds of destruction, all kinds of indescribable power gathered from every part of the endless world and covered the bodies of the six tribulation experts who were carrying out the destruction. This power was like bad luck. Even when the six tribulation experts breathed, they had to worry about whether they would suffer irreparable damage because of this breath. In the face of this situation, the six tribulation experts were both helpless and happy. The helpless thing was that this state of misfortune was too annoying. It made them unhappy no matter what they did. They were afraid that the ground would sink and crack when they walked, afraid that a spatial crack would suddenly appear in the sky when they flew, afraid that they would choke to death when they ate, afraid that they would choke to death when they drank water, afraid that they would encounter the aftermath of a battle when they walked casually, and even if they breathed, they were afraid that they would accidentally inhale some extremely destructive energy. This kind of encounter was enough to be fatal for ordinary creatures and even ordinary cultivators. For these six tribulation experts, although it wasn't to the point of being fatal, it was still quite an annoying thing. It made them feel happy and irritated everywhere. However, what they were happy about was that this situation clearly meant that their actions had already triggered all kinds of reactions from this branch of the island. It meant that their destructive experiments had been fruitful. Even if this kind of reaction was aimed at them, even if this kind of reaction was repelling them, even if this kind of reaction was against them, it couldn't change the fact that this was the reaction they were looking forward to. And this was obviously the purpose of their experiment. Therefore, how could they not be happy about this? The six tribulation experts who had transcended all over the world came to the surroundings of these destroyed worlds. When they saw these worlds being changed by the means of the six tribulation experts, their expressions became quite unsightly. It was only hundreds of thousands of worlds. Compared to the number of worlds in the endless world, it was an insignificant number. It was almost like a drop in the ocean. However, this was enough to trigger corresponding changes in the endless world. At this moment, they felt that the communication between their own worlds and the grand existence in the outside world was also greatly affected. At this moment, what they could feel was that the communication had weakened by nearly 10%. For these 6 tribulation experts who had transcended all over the world, this kind of influence simply reduced their cultivation efficiency by more than 10%. Facing such an unexpected disaster, how could they not feel dissatisfied with the 6 tribulation experts who had caused this? These 6 tribulation experts who had transcended all over the world were afraid of these foreign 6 tribulation experts, not because they thought that they were inferior to these foreign 6 tribulation experts. Instead, it was because the number of foreign 6 tribulation experts was simply too terrifying. Compared to the number of all the transcendents in the world, the number of 6 tribulation experts who had transcended all over the world was simply several billion times more. Any existence would inevitably feel short of breath when faced with a group of the same level as them, but with a group of tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of times more than them. If one didn't consider the whole group and only considered some 6 tribulation experts, then these transcendents were not weak at all. In fact, if they fought one-on-one, they had absolute confidence that they could defeat them. After all, no matter what, they had cultivated in this endless world for who knew how many trillion years. They had already obtained great benefits. Compared to before they entered this endless world, they had already obtained great improvements. With such improvements, if they still didn't have the confidence to defeat existences on the same level as them, then they wouldn't have been able to cultivate in this endless world for so many trillion years. At this time, these 6 tribulation experts who were carrying out destructive experiments were clearly only an insignificant part of the 6 tribulation experts from the outside world. Moreover, because of their previous efforts, they had already separated themselves from the 6 tribulation experts from the outside world. In this way, they naturally didn't need to be afraid of these 6 tribulation experts anymore. At this time, looking at these 6 tribulation experts who were about to suffer misfortune, the transcendent's expressions slowly turned malicious. Waves of killing intent locked onto these 6 tribulation experts. Clearly, they wanted to directly kill them. Naturally, the outsider 6 tribulation expert knew about their choice. However, most of the 6 tribulation experts just watched coldly from the sidelines. After all, although these 6 tribulation experts were a group, before this, they were just strangers. Those who were friends with each other were just individuals. Perhaps the relationship between them and the unlucky 6 tribulation master was even worse than the relationship between them and the transcendent masters at the 6 tribulation master level. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly go against these transcendent transcendents at the level of 6 tribulation for the sake of these 6 tribulation experts who had obviously committed a mistake? You want to fight us? A 6 tribulation expert with bad luck looked at the 6 tribulation experts around him who were glaring at him. His expression was extremely ugly. "You've made a mistake, so you need to accept punishment," said a transcendent with a face full of anger. "We did make a mistake, but isn't there a saying that goes, 'The ignorant are not guilty'? In the end, it's because you didn't inform us first that we made such a mistake. Since both of us are in the wrong, why don't we end it here? From now on, we will obediently follow your rules, and you will pretend that nothing happened. How about it?" The unlucky 6th tribulation expert sighed. "I won't tell you how many creatures died in the worlds you destroyed. I don't think you're interested in such a grand principle, and I don't have any interest in raising such a grand banner. To us, the bad luck that shrouds you is our hope to restore the efficiency of our cultivation. Do you think we can give up on it?" said the transcendent master indifferently. The hundreds of thousands of worlds destroyed by the foreign 6 tribulation experts were all complete worlds, with countless living beings living in them. As the worlds were destroyed, the majority of the creatures in those worlds were naturally destroyed as well. It could be said that in terms of the number of creatures, each of these 6 tribulation experts had already killed an unknown number of trillions of creatures. In terms of the standard of wiping out lives, their crimes were clearly too numerous to count. There was absolutely no room for forgiveness. However, it was clear that this was meaningless to the transcendent masters of the sixth tribulation level. After all, those transcendents at the level of the six tribulations were not saints. To be able to cultivate to the level of the six tribulations, each of them had destroyed countless worlds, and space-time. In terms of the number of lives destroyed, none of them were any better than Liu Jiejia's, who was conducting destructive experiments from the outside. Thus, none of these transcendent masters of the sixth tribulation level were moved by the fact that they had destroyed so many worlds and caused the deaths of so many creatures. Because of this, although using this reason to deal with the sixth tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments would put them in an absolutely correct position, none of these transcendents were willing to do so. After all, if they did so, anyone would know that it was an excuse. Clearly, these transcendent masters of the sixth tribulation level disdained to use this excuse to brush off the sixth tribulation experts of the sixth tribulation level. At this time, they directly stated the real reason for their actions. Apart from being angry that the sixth tribulation experts of the sixth tribulation level were affecting their cultivation efficiency, the most important reason was that the sixth tribulation experts of the sixth tribulation level were shrouded in the misfortune of the endless heavens and earth. This misfortune made the sixth tribulation experts of the endless heavens and earth extremely loathe the sixth tribulation experts of the endless heavens and earth. Thus, if someone could wipe them out, they would naturally be rewarded by the endless heavens and earth, and would naturally be able to obtain the benefits bestowed by the endless heavens and earth. This kind of benefit was clearly what these transcendent masters of the sixth tribulation level were looking forward to. After all, according to the current situation, this kind of benefit was very likely to restore their cultivation efficiency. Chapter 3165. If there was bad luck, then there would naturally be good luck. Since these six tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments would encounter misfortune after destroying the world, then getting rid of them would naturally be equivalent to helping the endless world to work. In that case, how could the endless heavens and earth not give them some good luck? And this good luck would most likely make up for their previous losses. It would be an extravagant hope to greatly increase their cultivation efficiency. However, it wouldn't be a problem at all for them to restore their cultivation efficiency that was previously damaged. It was precisely because of this that these transcendents of the sixth tribulation level were so proactive in attacking these six tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments. Hearing their words, the six tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments could only sigh inwardly. They originally had other things to say, but now they knew that there was no need to say them. When it came to benefits, justice and evil didn't matter. Then come. Let's see how much you've improved after staying here for so long. A sixth tribulation expert who was conducting a destructive experiment said to the transcending experts of the sixth tribulation level. My apologies, said a transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level. In the blink of an eye, the void transformed, and the projection of a world enveloped all the supreme transcendents who were conducting the destructive experiments. Fellow Taoist, you're going a bit too far. You're taking everything for yourself. The other transcendents couldn't help but feel anxious when they saw this. Fellow Taoists, you've misunderstood. You'll understand when you see it. The sixth tribulation expert didn't feel the slightest bit ashamed and directly said, the supreme transcendents who hadn't taken action immediately understood when they saw the projection. What did it look like? It was the projection of the battlefield that had appeared once in the endless tribulations. At this moment, as soon as the figure appeared, it began to give off an extremely stable aura. It seemed to resonate with the entire world, causing all sorts of strange existences to gather from all directions and enter the figure. Seeing this, the remaining transcendents at the sixth tribulation level naturally knew what to do. All kinds of power, brilliance, runes, divine abilities, and concepts began to emerge from their bodies. They turned into tornadoes that rushed straight towards the illusion of the battlefield and quickly merged with it. At this moment, They felt that the six tribulation experts who were conducting the destructive experiments were being suppressed by an unbelievably terrifying force. The suppression was so strong that it made the six tribulation experts feel like they had become mortals. They couldn't exert any extraordinary power at all. Facing such a situation, the six tribulation experts who were conducting the destructive experiments were inexplicably nervous. Their extraordinary power had been completely suppressed. This was not the first time they had encountered such a situation. There was everything in the Tao Master's path. Naturally, there would be many similar tests. For these six tribulation experts to be able to reach this step into the endless world, they had naturally experienced countless things. It was impossible for them not to have experienced the suppression of all their extraordinary power by the environment. However, even if they had experienced this kind of suppression, it didn't mean that they could calmly accept it. After all, they had been suppressed from a height that could destroy heaven and earth and create countless worlds to an ordinary creature that couldn't even fly. Under such circumstances, any change in the climate or natural disaster would be enough to render them helpless. Even if it wouldn't directly kill them, it wouldn't be a problem to turn them into ants in front of the six tribulation experts. At this moment, in the face of such suppression, the six tribulation experts certainly didn't just give up. After all, this kind of suppression was only brought about by the projection of the battlefield. Compared to the many opportunities derived from the real Tao Master's path and the opportunities created by the true saints, the suppression was naturally incomparable. The suppression from the opportunities created by the true saints was naturally almost absolute. It was a suppression that the six tribulation experts couldn't break through no matter how hard they tried. In the face of such suppression, they could only obediently begin to strive for survival bit by bit in accordance with the rules of suppression. However, it was clear that the suppression from the heaven and earth phantom on the battlefield was far from sufficient in terms of strength. Even if the creator of the heaven and earth battlefield phantom was a six tribulation powerhouse, even if it was endowed with various special meanings by the endless heaven and earth due to its role in the endless heaven and earth tribulation, it still couldn't compare to the land of opportunity created by the true saints. It was precisely because of this that although the suppression effect was strong, it was not absolute. At first glance, the six tribulation experts seemed to have all their extraordinary power and means completely suppressed. But in fact, they could still find some extraordinary power and means in the depths of their bodies if they tried their best to search. It was only because of the suppression of the battlefield's projection that they seemed to be faintly discernible. What kind of existence were the six tribulation experts? They were existences that could destroy hundreds of thousands of worlds in such a short time after stepping into the endless world. Such an existence's mobility was much stronger than that of an ordinary six tribulation expert. How could they not be able to find the traces of extraordinary power and means that were not completely suppressed in their bodies? At this time, strange cracks began to appear on their bodies. These cracks were faintly discernible, as if they were deeply engraved into their bodies or integrated into the void. They were faintly discernible, more like cracks appearing on the law layer. It seemed extremely wonderful and extremely dangerous. At the same time, there were indescribable sounds constantly coming from their bodies. The hundreds of thousands of six tribulation experts looked like the source of hundreds of thousands of lightning bolts at this moment. They were scattered all over the battlefield and were constantly rumbling. This kind of shaking seemed to be directly acting on the origin of the battlefield's projection. When this kind of shaking sounded, the entire battlefield seemed to be shaking slightly. It could be predicted that it wouldn't be long before the entire battlefield completely collapsed due to the increasingly intense shaking. Even if the world itself didn't collapse, the laws that imprison them would definitely collapse. If things didn't change, but it was clear that the current situation was constantly changing. The one who had created this battlefield's projection was only one of the many six tribulation experts who had transcended the world. But he wasn't alone. He hadn't thought that he could deal with hundreds of thousands of six tribulation experts by himself. At this moment, there were hundreds of millions of six tribulation experts around this six tribulation expert, ready to get a piece of the pie at anytime. The hope that these 6 tribulation experts who were carrying out destructive experiments saw could be extinguished at any time. Just as the cracks on these 6 tribulation experts' bodies continued to increase, the battlefield's projection suddenly solidified. The already extremely powerful suppression instantly increased by several times. The cracks that had been constantly expanding and getting closer to the battlefield's core were instantly suppressed by the suppression that had suddenly increased by several times. Although the cracks didn't close, the expanding trend had been completely stopped. Moreover, as time passed, the battlefield's projection became more and more solid. The suppression also became stronger and stronger as time passed. Under such a change, the 6 tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments felt that the wisps of extraordinary power and methods in their bodies that they had discovered seemed to have turned into candlelight in the wind, as if they could be completely extinguished at any time. We definitely can't go on like this. We have to risk our lives. The 6 tribulation experts clearly knew this. This kind of message reverberated in the hearts of many 6 tribulation experts. For 6 tribulation experts, as long as they had a bit of extraordinary power, they could create a flower. At this moment, although every 6 tribulation powerhouse had only grasped a wisp of the increasingly weaker extraordinary power and means, they could already do things that ordinary cultivators could not even imagine by relying on these wisps of extraordinary power and means. For them, connecting hundreds of thousands of 6 tribulation experts together didn't even require any effort to plan. They could just rely on their instincts to do it. Countless messages reverberated in the hearts of the 6th tribulation experts. Not long after, they had already thought a method. The situation was already extremely urgent, so they naturally didn't have the time to go deeper into the discussion. After discussing this feasible method, they immediately took action. In an instant, specks of light started to appear from the bodies of hundreds of thousands of 6 tribulation experts. After they appeared, they frantically gathered towards a certain part of the battlefield's projection. After those specks of light left, the cracks on the bodies of the 6 tribulation experts instantly closed. The traces of extraordinary aura that originally existed on their bodies also completely disappeared. At the same time, a figure gradually appeared at the spot where the specks of light converged. As soon as this figure appeared, it naturally released an inconceivable aura. The surrounding space seemed to have become extremely fragile and thin ice, instantly shattering. This shattering was not the shattering of the void itself, nor was it the destruction of space-time itself. Instead, it was a deeper destruction of laws, and even nothingness. Even the great Tao corresponding to that location seemed to show signs of destruction at this moment. An incomparably grand aura was constantly emitted from the figure's body like a balloon. Although the aura became weaker the further away it was from the battlefield due to the suppression of the heaven and earth phantom, the power of the aura still spread throughout the entire battlefield, completely enveloping every inch of the heaven and earth phantom within the heaven and earth phantom. Boom, 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 boom. Terrifying rumbles constantly rang out from the figure's body. Every time a rumble rang out, the entire battlefield's projection would violently tremble, as if a huge hammer was constantly bombarding the battlefield. The scene before them was the result of the traces of the 6 tribulation experts remaining extraordinary power and methods that had yet to be suppressed gathering together. With this method, they directly gathered a clone that possessed a portion of the 6 tribulations' power. That's right, this was the power clone of hundreds of thousands of 6 tribulation experts. Because the clone was formed from all the extraordinary powers and methods that had yet to be suppressed, its resistance to the suppression of the battlefield's projection was many times stronger than that of ordinary experts who had undergone 6 tribulations. Even in the projection of the battlefield, it could still erupt with unimaginable power. It forcibly created a suppressed vacuum in the projection of the battlefield, allowing the avatars of hundreds of thousands of 6 tribulation powerhouses to unleash their full strength in it. Because this clone was formed from the power of hundreds of thousands of 6 tribulation experts, it had a brand new consciousness. Although it would instinctively work hard for the six tribulation experts and try its best to help them, it was still a brand new living being after all. At this moment, it slowly opened its eyes and looked at the extremely strange world in front of it for the first time. As an existence that opened its eyes to see the outside world for the first time, there was boundless curiosity in its eyes. This curiosity was so strong that it found everything it saw interesting. Even the scene of space-time collapsing, even the scene of hundreds of thousands of six tribulation experts being suppressed into ordinary living beings was so interesting. So, this is what it feels like to be alive. After a long time, the clone sighed. Its voice was filled with boundless joy and inexplicable disappointment. Although it had come back to life, it was still the clone of hundreds of thousands of six tribulation experts. Too many orders were engraved on its essence, and it could not truly be free. Chapter 3166. The strength of this battlefield lay in its steadiness, stability, and the extraordinary suppressive effect formed by the joint efforts of many transcendents at the level of six tribulation and the boundless world. There is no need to mention its stability and solidity. The original body of this battlefield was only for fourth tribulation experts. In other words, only fourth tribulation experts and those below them could the stability and solidity of this battlefield reach an unshakable level. Once a cultivator's cultivation realm was stronger than that of a fourth tribulation expert, the stability and stability of the battlefield would obviously be insufficient. But now, the essence of the avatars formed from the little bit of extraordinary power and extraordinary means of the six tribulation experts was still at the six tribulation level no matter what. This clearly far exceeded the limit that the original body of the battlefield could withstand. Even though the current projection of the battlefield had become much more stable than the original battlefield due to the support of the boundless world, it still could not withstand the pressure of the six tribulation experts. Therefore, in terms of stability alone, this battlefield's phantasm was obviously nothing in front of the avatars of hundreds of thousands of six tribulation powerhouses. This extraordinary suppression effect was obviously remarkable for the hundreds of thousands of six tribulation powerhouses. It was enough to make those six tribulation powerhouses only have a trace of extraordinary power and means left. But how was this avatar formed? The power that made up the whole incarnation was the accumulation of the superhuman power and methods left in the six tribulation experts after they were suppressed by the battlefield, which even the suppression of the battlefield couldn't do anything to. Such a complete incarnation was equivalent to transferring the suppression of the heaven and earth projection of the battlefield to him once. In this way, the suppression that the avatar suffered was naturally not worth mentioning. It was precisely because of this that the clone was able to display such an unbelievable performance at this moment. It easily blocked the suppression effect that could suppress many of its main bodies into ordinary beings, and then it almost completely broke the projection of the battlefield in front of it. Such a change was not within the expectations of the transcending experts at the level of the sixth tribulation. But at this moment, not a single one of them panicked because of this. Although they did not expect such a change, they had long expected the six tribulation experts sealed in the battlefield to have the means to resist. Although the change in front of them was beyond their expectations, they were not surprised by the strength of the resistance. Therefore, at this moment, in the face of this avatar, the next round of changes that the six tribulation experts had set up began to appear. Countless figures appeared out of thin air in the battlefield. These figures looked exactly the same as the hundreds of millions of six tribulation transcendents outside. They were their avatars. Moreover, they were not ordinary avatars. Instead, they were avatars formed from the laws, power, and even more mysterious existences in the battlefield projection. This kind of incarnation, which was formed from the material of this battlefield, naturally wouldn't be affected by the suppression effect of the battlefield like foreign living beings. At this moment, after these avatars appeared in the battlefield projection, they all began to exude unimaginable auras. In an instant, the entire battlefield projection became like a chaotic ocean of aura. With the appearance of these countless auras, the battlefield projection, which had been on the verge of collapse under the impact of the Avatar's auras, broke away from its trembling. Instead, it became more and more stable. The reason for this was actually very simple. These newly appeared avatars of the Transcendence at the level of the Sixth Tribulation appeared to be their avatars, as if they were terrifying expert from outside. But in reality, because everything that made up these avatars came from the projection of this battlefield, there was no external power present in these avatars at all. This made these avatars essentially a part of this battlefield. And since they were a part of the battlefield, the power of these avatars, the order of these avatars, the essence of these avatars, and the various incredible abilities they possessed naturally belonged to the battlefield. In other words, when the Sixth Tribulation experts created these avatars in the battlefield projection, it was equivalent to giving their cultivation path, their worldview, their power, their abilities, their understanding of cultivation, the universe, the world, and everything else to a part of the battlefield. It was just that these bestowments existed in the form of avatars. And this bestowment clearly greatly increased the foundation and potential of this battlefield's illusory world, causing the illusory world's ability to endure to increase substantially with their appearance. In the end, this resulted in the current situation. The battlefield projection was less and less affected by the auras of the avatars of the hundreds of thousands of Sixth Tribulation experts. In the end, it could not be seen that it was affected at all. Give me some face and let me take them away. The incarnation looked at the hundreds of millions of figures around him who were not any weaker than him and sighed. Do you think that's possible? If you do something wrong, you have to pay the price. A supreme expert at the Sixth Tribulation level sighed. So that's how it is. What a pity. The Avatar revealed a disappointed expression. The purpose of his birth was to save his hundreds of thousands of true bodies. Even if he didn't want to care about them, the orders engraved in his essence forced him to do so. Even if he had to pay the price of his life to do so, it was still the same. Goodbye. The Transcendence expert had a regretful expression on his face as he spoke. Following his words, the hundreds of millions of Transcendent experts attacked at the same time. In the blink of an eye, everything in this world collapsed. In the blink of an eye, the world turned from a clear state to a paste that seemed to be in a state of chaos. In this paste, there were only the incarnations of the Transcendence at the level of the Sixth Tribulation experts, the Sixth Tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments, and the incarnation that was protecting them firmly under the cover of its own power. However, the overall appearance of the incarnation was completely different from before. Although he could see that there were boundless restraints and suppression in all directions, his own aura was incomparably harmonious, and the aura around him was even more perfect and flawless. As he floated there, he was like an independent universe, naturally emitting a transcendent charm. But now, although his aura was still there and his aura was still powerful, it had completely lost its previous perfection. He looked like a universe that had become riddled with holes and could collapse at any time. It gave off a feeling that he could completely disappear in the next moment without anyone touching him. What's the point? A transcendent expert at the Sixth Tribulation level couldn't help but sigh when he saw this. As one of the attackers, he could not be more clear about what had happened. Just now, it was this incarnation that had cut off all possibilities of his future, forcefully compressing all possibilities of his future and exploding them in an instant. By relying on this eruption, he had barely blocked their attack, and under the attack, he had barely managed to protect his many true bodies. After completely compressing all external possibilities and exploding them in an instant, this avatar had lost all possibilities. For him, this instant was his everything. Apart from this instant, he no longer existed at any other moment. Of course, this did not mean that he would be completely erased. If it was an ordinary living being, or even an ordinary cultivator, they would only be completely erased by the space-time dimension, karma, fate, and even the state of chaos. But it was clear that as a Sixth Tribulation expert, this avatar would not end up like this. It was not because he could resist the erasure of space-time dimension, karma, fate, and even the state of chaos. If he could really do that, he would have become a true sage long ago. Why would he still be here? As a sixth tribulation expert, although he could not avoid the unimaginable erasure, he could find another way to bypass this erasure. This method was very simple. It was to expand one's present to the future that one could achieve. The specific method was to travel through billions of trillions of times in the present and project one's present into every instant in the future. If that was the case, although he would appear to exist for a period of time as if he was no different from a normal living being, he would essentially be the person he was in the instant when he chose to abandon all possibilities of his future. From the perspective of a normal living being, he lived every minute and second of time like a normal living being. But for him, it was as if every minute and second of his experience in the future was injected into his mind at the same time. In essence, it was as if an information bomb had been detonated in his mind. From the principle of getting rid of erasure, it could be seen that this method was obviously a choice that could only be made when one was aware that they would perish together. After all, even a sixth tribulation expert's mind and body had a limit to what they could endure. Countless instantaneous experiences were compressed into a single instant and injected into his mind and body. It was naturally not a problem if the amount was small, but when the amount reached a certain level, it was inevitable that his mind and body would explode. In other words, from now on, the time that this avatar could exist had become quite limited. As for how long it could exist, whether it was thousands of years, a few months, or hundreds of millions of years, it would depend on the endurance of this avatar. If its endurance was strong enough, it might be able to continue existing for hundreds of millions of years. But if its endurance was too weak, it might only be a few months, or even a few hours, or even a few breaths. Of course, this was also related to what he wanted to do. If it was just to see the future and see what he wanted to see every once in a while, the pressure that instant could bring him would naturally not be too great, and he would naturally be able to endure for a little longer. However, if it was for a battle, the situation would obviously be completely different. It was not only because of the myriad of information that he needed to pay attention to in a battle, where the amount of information was trillions of times more than usual, but also because of the time interval. There was obviously no fixed standard for how many periods of time could be divided into. Just like a day, you could divide it into 24 hours, 12 hours, 1,440 minutes, or 86,400 seconds, or even more finely divided. As for how to divide it, it would depend on how precise one wanted it to be. If one wanted higher precision, they would have to divide it more finely. If one did not need high precision, they would have to divide it more coarsely. Obviously, for this avatar, the impact on precision was even greater. He relied on himself to travel through countless periods of time in an instant, which allowed him to continue existing as time passed. Under such circumstances, he seemed to appear continuously, as if he was moving forward with the passage of time at every moment. But in fact, he existed in the form of flashes. Between one appearance and the next, there was a relatively short period of time where he did not exist. Whether this period of time where he did not exist was long or short depended on his choice. If there was nothing important and he just wanted to see what he wanted to see, then this period of time could be longer. Not to mention an instant, it was not impossible to calculate it in days, months, years, decades, centuries, or even millennia. However, if he wanted to fight, this period of time obviously could not be too long. If two people were fighting, and one of them suddenly disappeared for a period of time, how could he win the battle? Therefore, if there was nothing else, according to the endurance of this avatar, he might be able to extend his existence to as long as billions of years. However, if he were to fight, he might need to divide this instant into billions of parts, so that he could appear in these billions of time periods at the same time. In that case, the time that he could exist might be compressed from billions of years to an instant. Chapter 3167. Moreover, even so, he was destined to fail in the upcoming battle. After all, his opponent was a sixth tribulation expert. And it wasn't just one or two, but hundreds of millions of sixth tribulation experts. In a battle of this level, even if he was distracted for a millionth of a second, his flaws would be grasped and he would be completely destroyed. Not to mention the millionth of a second that only appeared once in a while. Even if this period of time was extremely short, perhaps even less than a millionth of a second, it couldn't change the nature of the clone. It could be said that it would be fine if the battle didn't erupt, but once it did, the clone would definitely fail in a few moments and be completely erased from existence. It was precisely because of this that the sixth tribulation experts felt it was such a pity. That was why they felt that the clone's choice wasn't worth it. This is the meaning of my existence. There's no such thing as whether it's worth it or not. This sentence came from the clone's mouth. However, this voice sounded rather strange. It was as if this voice was a branch extracted from the cacophony of noises. All the transcendent beings could clearly hear that there were countless other noises behind this voice. Hearing this voice, the supreme transcendence felt even more pity. This situation clearly meant that their previous guess was correct. The entire avatar in front of them had indeed expanded itself into the future for an instant. At this moment, it sounded as if he was communicating with them, as if he was only replying after they had spoken. But in fact, this was just an illusion. At this moment, the words spoken by the other party were spoken in a special way at the point of time in which he existed. In the ears of the transcendents at the level of the six tribulations, this was a sentence, but to the incarnation, it was just a rather special voice. It was just that the volume, pitch, and timbre of the voice would be different depending on the time he chose to focus on. Finally, the voice would gather at different points of time to form such a sentence. In fact, it wasn't just now. Perhaps in the future, all the sounds he made and every word he said would be made in a similar manner. He only had a moment of time left, but in the end, he was able to do it as if he was a normal being. He had the possibility and time, and he was no different from a living being. This method was so ingenious that even these transcendents at the level of the sixth tribulation were secretly shocked. They wondered if they would be able to do this if they only had one last moment left to live. This answer made them feel secretly ashamed. It was obvious that none of them had the confidence to do that. Not only did this require a big enough imagination, but it also required an extremely strong desire to survive. If one didn't have a big enough imagination, they wouldn't be able to think of using this method to treat that instant as a long period of time. Without an extremely strong desire to survive, even if they thought of this method, they would not be able to execute it. After all, just by thinking about it, one would know that it wouldn't bring pleasure, but only pain and torture. In that instant, memories that would surpass what one could bear would be directly poured into one's mind. This feeling was definitely not pleasant. Furthermore, even if that was the case, the world and the future that he saw were actually extremely different from the actual future. After all, as an existence that only had a momentary moment in time, what he could see was only the momentary moment in time in the future. And this kind of future was actually a static image. He had to reorganize and even deceive himself to connect the images and sounds of different moments in time together. Only then would he be able to see the moving future. To use a very common analogy, from the moment he lost all possibilities, what this incarnation could see were only pictures. If he wanted to see a future that could really move, a future that was close to reality, he had to connect these pictures together and move them quickly like a movie. He had to rely on his own illusion, which was the effect of self-deception, to think that it was a moving picture. Continuing to exist and observe the future in this way was obviously very different from experiencing it in the real world. But for these six tribulation experts who had transcended, none of them thought that they would be willing to see the future in this way. And it was clear that the incarnation had chosen to see the future in this way. What this meant couldn't be more obvious. This clearly meant that for the incarnation, even using this method to see the future was an incomparably precious opportunity for him. Moreover, he had to give up this incomparably precious opportunity for those six tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments. Thinking of this, how could these transcendent experts not feel sad. Facing this situation, the incarnation didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. At this moment, his expression was a little blank, and his eyes were a little empty. Although he was standing there, he didn't seem to be looking at these transcendent experts. And that was the truth. At this moment, in the eyes of the incarnation, what he saw wasn't a specific moment in time, but everything that he could bear, everything that would happen in time. In this way, he could say that one was everything, and everything was one. Let's wait. A transcendent expert at the sixth tribulation level sighed. The other transcendent transcendents only sighed inwardly when they heard this, but none of them raised any objections. As a result, the projection of the battlefield fell into a strange silence. This projection of the battlefield was not an ordinary existence. It was a battlefield specially created to suppress the six tribulation experts, so it naturally couldn't be this weak. Even if it was destroyed by the many transcendent experts and returned to a chaotic state, it was only temporary. It didn't mean that it would completely collapse. In fact, because all of these transcending experts at the sixth tribulation level came from the projection of the battlefield, they were actually a part of the battlefield. As long as they didn't return to primal chaos along with the world, the foundation of the battlefield would still exist. As time passed, with their existence as a fulcrum, the world would eventually return to its normal state after a period of time. Like a spring, as long as the pressure it faced didn't exceed its limit, the spring would eventually be able to bounce back. For the battlefield, these six tribulation experts were equivalent to the bearing capacity of the spring. As long as they existed, even if the battlefield became even more chaotic, even if it seemed to have split into countless pieces that couldn't be retrieved, it would still be able to reform after a certain period of time and return to its original state. At this moment, as the transcendent experts at the sixth tribulation level stopped moving, the viscous state of the battlefield projection gradually faded. The sky, the earth, the mountains, the rivers, the vital energy, the laws, time, space, and everything else gradually emerged from the viscous state. In the end, after an unknown period of time, the battlefield returned to its normal state. The world became clear once more, and everything appeared in the battlefield once more. The stability and stability of the battlefield once more filled the interior of the projection. From the looks of it, apart from the difference in appearance, it was not much different from the heaven and earth phantom of the battlefield at the beginning. The six tribulation powerhouses who were conducting destructive experiments were gathered around the Avatar. Under the protection of the Avatar's power, they struggled to resist the various powers that were constantly eroding them from the battlefield's phantasm. Now that they had been completely suppressed by the battlefield, they didn't have any extraordinary power or methods. Although their intrinsic qualities as six tribulation experts still existed, and they could still protect their intrinsic qualities so that they wouldn't die from some ordinary disasters, they couldn't avoid being in a sorry state. At this moment, they were like ants struggling on the surface of a stormy sea. Even if they didn't move, they were still enduring all sorts of unimaginable and terrifying blows. If they moved, they would really be in a pit with every step and a pit with every 3 steps. If it was an ordinary person, they would probably die dozens of times in a few steps. The only reason they were able to survive was because of their intrinsic quality as six tribulation experts. In the face of such a predicament, the six tribulation experts still didn't give up hope. At this moment, they were trying their best to analyze the laws of the battlefield, trying their best to regain some extraordinary power and methods. Even ordinary people could rely on various methods to grasp greater power in any world, whether it was through self-cultivation or external help. If even ordinary people were like this, there was naturally no need to mention these six tribulation experts. With their wisdom, experience, and knowledge, even a rock would probably be fried until oil would flow out. Moreover, they weren't in a situation where only oil flowed out from a rock. Don't forget, they still had that incarnation. That incarnation was like a fish on a chopping board in the eyes of the six tribulation experts who had transcended the world. As long as they wanted to, they could instantly get rid of it. However, no matter what, he was still in existence at the level of a sixth tribulation expert. Even if this sixth tribulation expert only existed for a moment and all the possibilities of the future had already been sacrificed, this essence didn't change. They were all existences that were billions and trillions of times more powerful than ordinary living beings. Even a trace of such an existence's power was enough to suppress the world, enough to allow an ordinary person to grow to an unimaginably terrifying level. And at this moment, the sixth tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments were still the true bodies of the incarnations. Although the proportion of each sixth tribulation expert to the incarnation was extremely small, it was still a small proportion of a sixth tribulation expert's body. Relying on this tiny proportion, the number of operations they could complete had definitely reached a shocking level. At this time, their analysis of the laws of this battlefield clearly relied heavily on this slight proportion. And this small proportion also allowed them to obtain unimaginable gains. Just as the six tribulation experts who had transcended the world were quietly waiting for the incarnation to enjoy a rare moment of peace and witness the future that they could see at will, the six tribulation experts gradually began to gain something from their analysis of the illusory battlefield. This gain wasn't enough to restore their cultivation realm and completely break free from the suppression of the battlefield. It wasn't even enough for them to break free from any suppression from the illusory battlefield. But it was enough for them to start from zero. With the help of the various laws of the battlefield, they could cultivate strands of new extraordinary power. This extraordinary power was based on the illusory battlefield, but it was only slightly stronger than that of ordinary mortals. In the hands of the six tribulation experts, this extraordinary power was like a flower. It was enough for them to use these strands of power to achieve all sorts of unimaginable things that even itinerant immortals, primordial immortals, and even connate grand luo cultivators couldn't do. However, this was the extent of his innate inferiority, not to mention comparing him to a tribulation eminence. Even a quasi-sage would be worlds apart. However, the six tribulation experts weren't discouraged. Previously, when they were suppressed to become ordinary people, they could still muster up their faith and regroup. Now that they had grasped strands of extraordinary power, how could they be worse than before? At that moment, they began to use the proportion that they obtained from their incarnations to deepen and enhance the wisps of extraordinary power, hoping to raise the power to a level that could help them in their current situation. Chapter 3168. The transcendent experts were well aware of the actions of the hundreds of thousands of six tribulation experts. After all, their mission in this heaven and earth phantom battlefield was to get rid of these six tribulation powerhouses. Even if they were shocked by the incarnation and decided to give it some time, it didn't mean that they would forget their fundamental goal. Therefore, while they were waiting, they were still paying attention to the actions of the six tribulation powerhouses at all times. At this time, all the efforts that the six tribulation experts had put in to master extraordinary powers and extraordinary methods were naturally seen by them. However, not a single transcendent expert cared about their efforts. Even the transcendent realm expert who had the most intense reaction only glanced at one of the six tribulation experts who had made the biggest move. The reason for this was simple. It was because their efforts were nothing more than a deathbed struggle in the eyes of the transcendents at the sixth tribulation level. It should be known that one couldn't become a tribulation expert just by relying on oneself. To become a tribulation expert, the influence of the environment was also an extremely important factor. In this endless world, before the appearance of the transcendent experts, how could there be any peak supreme emperor who could become a tribulation expert? Was it because they weren't intelligent enough, talented enough, or capable enough? If it was just one world, it was possible. However, there were tens of thousands of worlds, or even billions of worlds. There were so many worlds, so many cultivators, and so many supreme emperors. No matter how small the probability was, it was impossible for all of them to not have enough intelligence, talent, or ability. Among them, there must be some who could become a tribulation expert according to their own conditions, but for various reasons, they couldn't break through. This was because becoming a tribulation expert, or rather, becoming a tribulation expert, had a very strict requirement for the environment. If the environment wasn't good, no matter how strong one was, it was impossible to become a tribulation expert. At this time, although the 6 tribulation experts who were conducting the destructive experiments were already 6 tribulation experts, because of the suppression of the battlefield's projection, they couldn't use everything they had before. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to become tribulation experts again, they could only rely on the battlefield itself. This was equivalent to a brand new achievement, a brand new breakthrough. In this case, it was naturally impossible for them to make breakthroughs using their original realms, and it was impossible for them to use the various comprehensions they had before. Instead, it required a whole new realm and a whole new understanding. And these new realms and new understandings were related to the environment. Without the help of the environment, it would be impossible for them to become tribulation experts, even if they were 6 tribulation experts and had experienced a breakthrough to the tribulation realm. Obviously, this heaven and earth phantom battlefield did not have the environment for them to break through. With the environment here, even the 6 tribulation cultivators could only raise their cultivation level to the peak of the Emperor realm at most. If they want to make further breakthroughs, they would have to take a part of this battlefield with them and transcend. And to do this, at the very least, he needed the agreement of the many 6 tribulation experts who had constructed this battlefield. In other words, whether or not they could break through completely depended on the will of the 6 tribulation experts who created this battlefield. In this case, it was only natural that the 6 tribulation experts who had transcended were so calm. Peak Supreme Emperors might be extremely powerful to ordinary cultivators, and they could even destroy the world with ease. However, compared to 6 tribulation cultivators, such existences were only relatively larger ants. Even if there were hundreds of thousands of such existences, those 6 tribulation experts could easily crush them with a single slap. How could the 6 tribulation experts who had carried out destructive experiments not know this? However, even if they knew this, they could not give up. If they continued working hard, there was still a slim chance that they could survive. If they gave up, there was a 100% chance that they would not survive. There was no need to explain the choice between a 1 in 10,000 chance of survival and a 100% chance of not surviving. Therefore, at this moment, they were still doing their best to strengthen the traces of extraordinary power they had obtained. They worked hard to raise the level of these extraordinary powers, and in turn, they used these extraordinary powers to raise their own realm in this battlefield. After all, they were 6 tribulation experts. In this realm, where they were not even itinerant immortals, it was almost impossible for them to improve themselves. It did not take long for these 6 tribulation experts' realms to rise steadily. All of them brazenly broke through the boundary between the mortal realm and the immortal realm, becoming itinerant immortals or something similar to them. When they obtained this level of strength, each of them exuded an extraordinary aura that belonged to them. They seemed to be tens of thousands of times stronger than before. After all, even a trace of extraordinary power could erupt with unimaginable power under their control as 6 tribulation experts. It was even enough to threaten Khanate Grand Luo cultivators. Currently, the extraordinary powers that they grasped were clearly tens of thousands of times stronger than before, be it in terms of quantity or level. In this way, under their control, the strength that they could unleash directly surpassed the boundary of a demi-saint and reached the level of a false saint. In fact, some of them had even barely reached the bottom line of a false saint. It could be said that if they were in an ordinary world and faced ordinary enemies, this would be more than enough. However, their enemies were not ordinary enemies, and they were not in an ordinary world either. Instead, they were in the projection of the battlefield that was specially created to suppress them. Facing such enemies, there was no difference in their level of strength compared to before. They were still just ants. Therefore, even though they had obtained such a huge improvement, they still did not attract the attention of too many 6 tribulation experts who had transcended the world. They were still as transparent as before. Under the protection of their incarnations, They continued to work hard to strengthen the extraordinary power and methods that they had obtained. They worked hard to obtain even greater strength and stronger resistance before those transcending experts made a move. Time ticked by, and a few days passed in the blink of an eye. After several days of hard work, among the hundreds of thousands of Sixth Tribulation experts who carried out this destructive experiment, a Sixth Tribulation expert finally appeared. Relying on his own extraordinary methods, he forcibly raised his cultivation realm in the projection of the battlefield to the level of a peak supreme emperor. Vaguely, there were signs that he was going to advance further. At this moment, a Sixth Tribulation expert who had transcended the world sighed and said, "Time's up." When the other transcending experts heard this, they all sighed, but did not refute his judgment. "Thank you, fellow Taoists, for giving me so much time," the Incarnation said with a rather stiff expression at this moment. His face was stiff, not because of his emotions, but because he couldn't make any more colorful expressions. After all, he looked very normal at this moment, but every moment was him in the past. Under such circumstances, it was already very rare for him to think of using a certain voice to express different tones, timbre, and volume at different times to form meaningful words to communicate with these transcending experts. If they wanted him to go one step further and show a complex expression corresponding to his words, it would obviously be too much. After all, voices could be superimposed, but could facial expressions be superimposed as well? Perhaps by using some special methods, he might be able to forcefully stack them, but the amount of effort required was not equal to the amount of rewards he would gain. The Incarnation's expression remained rather stiff. "Since you're satisfied, it's time to go on your way," a transcendent transcendence expert sighed at the Incarnation. "Although I'm grateful to all of you, I won't give up without a fight. I hope that all of you will be careful," the Incarnation said to the many transcending experts. The voice was still the same as before, as if it had been extracted from an endless amount of noise. His expression was also as stiff as before. The Sixth Tribulation experts could only sigh inwardly. Then, powerful auras began to gradually spread from their bodies. At this moment, the Sixth Tribulation experts who were conducting destructive experiments also noticed the changes here. Their expressions all became incomparably grave. "Unfortunately, there's no more time," a Sixth Tribulation expert said. As he spoke, the extraordinary power and methods on his body instantly expanded like a balloon being inflated. Along with this change, the other hundreds of thousands of Sixth Tribulation powerhouses also experienced similar changes at the same time. At this moment, almost all the Sixth Tribulation expert strength had crossed several or even dozens of levels, brazenly stepping into the Supreme Emperor realm. Clearly, they had already pushed their realm to the Supreme Emperor realm in this battlefield projection. However, due to various considerations, they simply didn't display it. At this moment, they discovered that the Sixth Tribulation experts had already lost their patience. Thus, they had no choice but to display their hidden strength. Then, an infinite amount of extraordinary power and methods began to gather from the hundreds of thousands of Sixth Tribulation experts in a frenzy towards the center, where the Incarnation was protecting all of them. As the countless extraordinary power and methods gathered, the Incarnation's body began to produce all sorts of subtle distortions. The originally subtle feeling of separation also began to gradually fade. Its stiff face also began to gradually become lively. "Sorry, that wouldn't be me anymore." At this moment, the Incarnation said these words. Compared to the voice that seemed to have been extracted from the noise earlier, this voice was much purer. It was more like the words spoken by a normal living being in a normal manner. From this appearance, it was obvious that the Sixth Tribulation experts had relied on their own extraordinary power and methods to save the Incarnation from a state where there was no future and all possibilities. However, from the words of the Incarnation, it seemed like it didn't appreciate this. "These are not my possibilities, nor are they my future." Then, these words came out of the Incarnation's mouth. At this moment, These words had already returned to the previous tone that seemed to have been extracted from the endless noise. Following these words, the incarnation's body froze, and then suddenly shook. With this shake, the exuberant life force on its body instantly disappeared without a trace. As his life force disappeared, the aura and presence that were extremely familiar to many transcending experts at the sixth tribulation level also disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Have a safe journey. A transcendent at the level of sixth tribulation side. Then, he did not hesitate to attack the incarnation. A ray of light flashed by and directly hit the incarnation. As it was hit by the light, the incarnation trembled slightly and directly collapsed, turning into endless powder. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. As he attacked, many other sixth tribulation experts also attacked. For a moment, the power and the illusion of the battlefield surged, and light flashed. In the blink of an eye, the hundreds of thousands of sixth tribulation experts who had been carrying out destructive experiments were completely wiped out. Not even a speck of dust remained. As they were erased, the power of misfortune that had gathered from the boundless world instantly collapsed. It began to gather toward the sixth tribulation experts who had transcended. This power continuously transformed as it gathered. When it truly enveloped these sixth tribulation experts, it seemed to have turned into something like auspicious clouds, and its nature was now the complete opposite of the misfortune from before. It had become something akin to a blessing, and what it brought to these transcendents was no longer the misfortune that these powers originally represented. Instead, it had become a blessing. Chapter 3169. Fortunately, they didn't react in time. Otherwise, things wouldn't have gone so smoothly. At this moment, a transcendent said in relief. The expressions of the other transcendent experts also changed slightly. Some revealed lingering fear, some revealed sudden realization, some rejoiced, and some were at a loss. Clearly, not everyone could understand the rejoicing of the transcendent experts. The rejoicing of the transcendent experts was naturally due to the fact that the other transcendent experts didn't interfere in the punishment of the transcendent experts. What he was worried about wasn't that the other transcendent experts would help the transcendent experts. Instead, he was worried that the other transcendent experts would steal their credit. He was worried that the other transcendent experts would attack the transcendent experts first. After all, after the transcendent experts decided to abide by the rules of the boundless world, they could already be considered a part of the boundless world. Such an existence was essentially not much different from them, who had transcended the world. In other words, what they could obtain, the transcendent experts could obtain as well. For example, if the other transcendent experts took the same action, they could also obtain the blessings they obtained. For them, this kind of blessings could restore their cultivation efficiency, which had been damaged by the boundless world. However, for the other transcendent experts, this kind of blessings could greatly enhance their cultivation efficiency in the boundless world. This kind of benefit was self-evident. It could be said that if the transcendent experts reacted and attacked the transcendent experts who were carrying out the boundless world's destructive experiments, it would be extremely convenient for them in the future. Unfortunately, the transcendent experts clearly hadn't completely changed their mindset. They didn't truly keep up with the times, so they missed this excellent opportunity. Although the sixth tribulation experts didn't notice it because it happened too quickly, they were still sixth tribulation experts after all. The fact that they couldn't react until now was enough to show how difficult it was to notice the subtlety of the situation. Naturally, not every single one of these transcending experts at the level of the sixth tribulation could see such subtle changes clearly. Thus, even after hearing the words of the transcendence expert, the others were still at a loss. They had no idea what he was trying to say. However, it was much easier to make predictions in hindsight than in advance. Thus, as time passed, the number of transcendents in the world who showed expressions of sudden realization increased. An increasingly intense feeling of joy began to appear in this part of the battlefield. In the end, these supreme transcendence at the level of sixth tribulation tacitly disappeared from the battlefield. Since he had already taken advantage of the situation, he naturally had to keep a low profile. If he continued to maintain a high profile, there might be new problems, and he might even lose the advantage that he had previously obtained. Many transcending experts at the level of sixth tribulation had a tacit understanding with each other. At this moment, they didn't even need to communicate with each other. Instead, they all withdrew the power, and other mysterious existences they had poured into the battlefield. As they withdrew these existences, the battlefield became thinner and more illusory. In the end, only a shadow was left. At this point, the transcendent transcendence expert who had constructed the projection of the battlefield in the first place finally took back everything he had used to construct the projection of the battlefield. As the illusory battlefield was taken back, the illusory battlefield also disappeared without a trace. Not a single trace of it was left behind. After finishing this step, the supreme transcendence finally relaxed. Everything was over. Even the bowls and chopsticks had been put away. No matter what, it was impossible to reverse the situation. After that, they bid each other farewell and returned to their respective worlds, beginning to enjoy the dividends that they had obtained from their previous efforts. After they disappeared for a while, a few figures appeared out of thin air where the original battlefield was. These were the figures of six tribulation experts. However, compared to before, these six tribulation experts had an additional identity. They were all supreme transcendence. Clearly, although not much time had passed, many of the six tribulation experts who had decided to abide by the rules of this endless world had grasped the key and become supreme transcendence in this endless world. It's a pity that we reacted too slowly and missed the opportunity. A sixth tribulation expert who came here sighed. After becoming supreme transcendence, they had truly felt the benefits that this endless world could bring to them. Although they came later, and their original cultivation environment was very different from the six tribulation experts who had entered before, there were still cultivators who had cultivated on the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. For such existences, they were essentially no different from the original six tribulation powerhouses. Naturally, they could also discover the benefits that the previous six tribulation experts could discover. The moment they became transcendent beings, they clearly sensed the tremendous communication between their own world and the boundless ocean of nothingness beyond it. They sensed the impact this communication had on their ideas, on their foundations, on their cultivation, and on their realms. After discovering this, some of the more quick-witted six tribulation experts thought of many other things. Then, they discovered the existence of the endless world's favor and care, and then linked it to the hidden benefits of the six tribulation experts who had previously carried out destructive experiments. Therefore, they could appear here at this time, ready to obtain those benefits. Unfortunately, they were still a step too late. By the time they arrived here, everything was already over. You guys did it cleanly. The six tribulation experts sighed and dispersed one by one. After that, more and more six tribulation experts appeared here, and then dispersed again. Their coming and going made this originally very ordinary void seem quite special, as if it was a very special scenic spot in this endless world. As for the six tribulation experts who came here, they either felt unhappy, regretful, or as if they had missed out on 100 million opportunities. Existences with different personalities behaved very differently. Luo Fan's incarnation was observing the changes taking place in the endless world, yet it seemed to be in an extremely mysterious place somewhere in the endless world. His perspective was naturally not that of an ordinary six tribulation expert. As the creator of this endless world, even if his authority in this endless world had been squeezed to the point where it was completely insufficient, he was still the creator of this endless world. As the creator of this endless world, perhaps his authority in this world could be squeezed or even taken away, but his view of this world and his perspective wouldn't change so easily. It was just like how parents looked at their children. Perhaps the children could continue to grow and eventually gain more and more autonomy and freedom. In the end, they could even completely separate from their parents and not even bother to listen to their parents' advice. However, in the eyes of parents, a child was a child. No matter how much they grew, in the eyes of parents, the child would always be that child. In the eyes of parents and in the eyes of others, the child would obviously be completely different. For Luo Fan, this endless world was like his child. Therefore, even if his authority in this endless world had been squeezed to the point where it could no longer be seen, the endless world in his eyes was still different from the endless world in the eyes of other six tribulation experts. His perspective of this endless world was directed at the source, the authority, and the will. At this moment, in his eyes, the endless world was divided into three parts. One of them was himself. His consciousness was the reflection of some kind of source in this endless world. This part of the reflection was displayed in the form of authority. As for the remaining two parts, they were the collective consciousness of the transcendent experts and the collective consciousness of the six tribulation experts, represented by the foreign six tribulation experts. As for the remaining two parts, they were not displayed in the form of authority. Among them, a part of the overall hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert was displayed in the form of authority, while the rest was displayed in the form of fate. The previous bad luck, good luck, and favor were obviously a small part of this reflection. As for the third part, which was the hidden consciousness of the foreign six tribulation experts, it was simply displayed in the form of resistance. This resistance was manifested in all aspects, whether it was authority, fate, or the reflection of the more fundamental consciousness. The relationship between these three parts was unusual. Among them, the reflection of Luo Fan's consciousness in this endless world was the bottom of everything, similar to the foundation that supported this endless world. The rules of this endless world that he had set were still the rules of this endless world. His likes and dislikes were also the likes and dislikes of this endless world. As for the overall hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert, it was like a big tree whose foundation extended to every detail of this endless world. Even on the foundation, the reflection of Luo Fan's consciousness in this endless world was also squeezed and eroded by this big tree. Now, the foundation that was supported by the reflection of Luo Fan's consciousness in this endless world had been partly seized by the overall hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert. Finally, the overall hidden consciousness of the foreign six tribulation expert wrapped the first two parts like smoke. Moreover, as time passed, the area it covered would become bigger and bigger. In the end, it would drown the entire endless world, or rather, the whole hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert. Among the three, the strongest was naturally the overall hidden consciousness of the foreign six tribulation expert. After all, the number of six tribulation experts from the outside world was beyond imagination. Their total number was even comparable to the number of transcendent experts that originally existed in this endless world. With so many six tribulation experts, one could imagine how enormous the overall hidden consciousness was. Even though the number of the transcendent experts in this endless world was no less than the number of the foreign six tribulation expert, don't forget that the good and bad transcendent experts were mixed together. Among them, most of them were only second or third tribulation experts. Only a small portion of those who had truly reached the sixth tribulation level were insignificant. How could the overall hidden consciousness of the foreign sixth tribulation expert compare to the overall hidden consciousness of the foreign sixth tribulation expert? Therefore, the overall hidden consciousness of the foreign sixth tribulation expert was the largest among the three parts. In terms of volume, it was probably tens of millions of times larger than the overall hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert. As for the rest, there was no need to mention the difference between the overall potential consciousness of the transcendence and the reflection of Luo Fan's consciousness in this endless world. As the creator of this boundless world, as the source of this boundless world, Luo Fan's authority in this boundless world was actually squeezed to such an extent. This was enough to show how big the difference was between his consciousness and the overall potential consciousness of a transcendent being. If the difference wasn't huge as the source of everything, the overall hidden consciousness of the transcendent expert wouldn't be able to shake the reflection of his consciousness. The difference in size between the three was a decreasing structure. However, the difference in volume was the quality of the three. The comparison between the quality of the three was the complete opposite of the difference in volume. In terms of volume, the overall hidden consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation expert was the largest. Moreover, it was tens of millions of times larger than the sum of the other two. However, in terms of quality, the overall hidden consciousness of the 4 and 6 tribulation expert was the weakest. Moreover, the gap was also tens of millions of times larger than that of the other two. The reason for this was very simple. The 4 and 6 tribulation expert was divided into countless small groups. Because they were divided into small groups, they seemed extremely scattered. Naturally, the overall hidden consciousness was also extremely scattered.